There is a desert in the American Southwest where the ground itself seems to hold its breath, where the red rock walls stretch so high they block out the afternoon sun, and the shadows fall in ways that make the canyon floor feel like the bottom of a different world entirely. A world that existed before roads, before maps, before any name we gave this land. And the people who have lived here longer than written history can reach, the Hopi, have always said the same thing. They have always looked at the ground beneath their feet and said, quietly and without apology, that something came before us. Not something primitive, not something less. Something ancient and complete, a civilization that lived not on the surface of this earth, but beneath it, in a world below the world, and that what we are only now beginning to find in the canyon walls and the buried chambers and the deep places where archaeology has barely scratched the surface is proof that they were right all along. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something. This is not a story that comes from the fringes. This is not the kind of story that requires you to abandon your skepticism or to accept things without evidence. The evidence is actually what makes this story so unsettling, because the evidence is real. The ruins are real. The chambers are real. The artifacts are real, and the Hopi oral tradition, which has been passed down in an unbroken chain for longer than most civilizations have existed, has been describing things that match what archaeologists are now digging up. And the two things, the ancient story and the modern discovery, are pointing at each other across a canyon of time and asking the same question. Who was here before us? If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now, and what time is it? Let's start in the place where this story begins and where it never really ends. The canyon country of the American Southwest. Arizona, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. These are not empty places. They never were. The cliffs and mesas and the labyrinth of stone passages that cut through the Colorado Plateau are riddled with evidence of human occupation going back thousands of years. But the further back you go, the stranger the evidence becomes, and the more it starts to look like something that doesn't fit neatly into the story we were told in school. The Hopi people live primarily on 3 mesas in northeastern Arizona, places they have occupied since before European contact, since before anyone from the outside world ever set eyes on the American Southwest and thought to write down what they saw. The Hopi have been there. And before they were on the mesas, they were somewhere else. And before that, they say, their ancestors were somewhere else still, below. In the world beneath this one. The Hopi concept of history is not linear the way Western history tends to be. It is not a straight line moving from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge, from darkness to light. The Hopi understand time as a series of worlds. The current world, the world we are living in right now, is the 4th world. Before the 4th world, there was the 3rd world. Before that, the 2nd. And before that, the 1st. Each world ended because the people who lived in it lost their way. Each time the world ended, a group of those who had remained faithful, who had remained connected to something true and sacred, were guided out of the dying world and into a new one. The emergence from the 3rd world to the 4th world, the world we are living in right now, is described in Hopi oral tradition with extraordinary specificity. The people did not simply walk out of one place and into another. They came up. They emerged from below. They climbed through an opening in the earth, guided by beings who helped them navigate the passage from one world to the next. And when they arrived on the surface, they arrived in the canyon country of the American Southwest, the very ground beneath which the entire story was supposed to have taken place. This is the part where most people, raised in a Western intellectual tradition, either file it away as mythology or move on. But here is the problem with doing that. The Hopi are not describing an event the way you would describe a dream or a metaphor. They are describing it the way you would describe geography. The opening through which the people emerged has a name. The ceremonies connected to the emergence are specific, detailed, and tied to actual physical places in the landscape. The kiva, the underground ceremonial chamber that is central to Hopi spiritual and social life, is a physical representation of the world below, a reminder of where the people came from. You go down into the kiva the same way the ancestors came up from the previous world. The symbolism is not abstract. It is architectural. It is carved into the way they build their buildings and organize their communities. And then, the archaeologists started finding chambers. The discovery that shook the Arizona archaeological community, though it was handled with such careful institutional language that most people outside academia never really noticed, came from a series of survey projects conducted in and around the Grand Canyon region, beginning in the late 20th century and accelerating in the early 21st. What they found was a network of subterranean passages and chambers that predated any known occupation of the region by a margin that was difficult to explain. Not impossible to explain, but difficult. The dates were pushed back further than the conventional narrative of southwestern prehistory was comfortable with, and the construction of some of these chambers, the deliberate shaping of the stone, the evidence of sustained occupation, the artifacts left behind, did not match the profile of simple shelter-seeking behavior. This was something else. This was habitation. This was, in the fullest sense of that word, home. To understand why this is significant, you need to understand what the conventional story of southwestern prehistory actually says. The standard model goes something like this. The earliest human inhabitants of the American Southwest were hunter-gatherers, following the big game herds that populated the continent after the last ice age. These groups, the ancestors of what archaeologists call the Paleo-Indians, moved through the landscape without settling. They did not build permanent structures. They did not live underground. They were surface dwellers, as most early humans are assumed to have been, moving with the seasons and the herds. Then, over time, certain groups began to settle. They began to cultivate crops. They built pit houses, then above-ground structures, then the remarkable multi-story cliff dwellings that tourists now visit in places like Mesa Verde in Colorado and Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. This is a story of upward movement, literally and figuratively. From the ground into structures built against the cliffs, from subsistence foraging to agricultural complexity, from small bands to something approaching organized civilization. But what the evidence from the canyon country is starting to suggest is that this story is incomplete, that there is a chapter before the chapter we know, and that chapter takes place underground. The Grand Canyon is one of the most studied geological formations on Earth. Scientists have been mapping its layers since the 19th century, cataloging its fossils, measuring its strata, trying to read in its walls the entire history of this part of the planet. And what they found, almost from the beginning, were human traces in places they did not expect. Pictographs on canyon walls so deep inside the system that reaching them required routes no casual traveler would take. Artifacts in caves accessible only by rope or by knowing pathways that only someone who lived there would know. Signs of fire in enclosed spaces far below the canyon rim, in places where the natural light never reaches, in places where you would have no reason to be unless you were using the darkness deliberately. For decades, most of this was attributed to ceremonial activity. The ancient people went down into the canyon to conduct rituals. The caves and chambers were sacred spaces, not living spaces. This is a reasonable interpretation, and it is probably partially true, but it is increasingly clear that the full truth is more complicated than that, because some of those caves show evidence not of brief ceremonial visits, but of extended occupation. There are hearths built for sustained use, not for single fires, but for fires kept going over seasons or years. There are grinding stones, the tools used daily for processing corn and seeds, tools you do not haul into a deep canyon for a ceremony, tools you keep where you live. There are storage features, built-in compartments in the cave walls that held food, materials, the accumulated goods of a people making a place their own. And in some locations, there are features that look, unmistakably, like the precursors to the kiva, underground chambers with specific architectural characteristics, a floor feature that served as a ventilation shaft, a small pit at the floor's center that corresponds to the sipapu, the sacred opening in every Hopi kiva that represents the point of emergence from the world below. You do not build a sipapu in a cave as a piece of temporary ritual furniture. You build a sipapu in a cave because you know what a sipapu means, and because you understand yourself as being in a relationship with the world below the world you currently occupy. You build it because the idea of emergence, of coming up from below, is not just a story you tell. It is a lived reality that has shaped your understanding of where you are and where you come from. The Hopi are not the only indigenous people of the American Southwest who carry traditions about life underground. The Zuni, whose ancestral territory overlaps with parts of what is now New Mexico and Arizona, have their own emergence traditions. The Navajo, whose origin stories are complex and multi-layered, include accounts of movement through a series of underworlds before the people arrived in this world. The various Pueblo peoples, the descendants of the people archaeologists call the ancestral Puebloans or the Anasazi, all carry in their traditions some form of memory about the world below and about the chambers that connect this world to that one. This is not the kind of cultural overlap that happens accidentally. When multiple distinct peoples, separated by language and territory and centuries of independent development, all carry versions of the same core story, something is driving that convergence. Either they all inherited the story from a common ancestor, which means the story is very old enough to predate their divergence as separate peoples, or they all had some form of direct experience that produced the same core narrative independently. Either way, the story points to something real, something that happened, something that was remembered. The Hopi tell it with a level of detail that goes beyond the kind of broad symbolic framework that most emergent stories operate within. They describe not just the fact of living below, but the nature of what life below was like. The third world, the world from which their ancestors emerged to come to this one, is described as a fully realized civilization, not a primitive stage of development, not a simple or backward existence. A civilization with all the complexity that word implies: communities, governance, craft, and knowledge, ways of understanding the world and organizing life within it that were sophisticated and complete. What destroyed it was not a lack of sophistication. The Hopi tradition is quite clear on this point. What destroyed the third world was a failure of values. The people became corrupt. They lost their connection to the Creator, to the sacred principles that had guided the civilization in its better days. They turned to conflict and manipulation and the pursuit of power over each other. And when that happened, the world they had built became unsustainable. The waters rose. The land was overwhelmed, and only those who had remained faithful, who had held on to something true, were led out and brought to this world, the fourth world, to begin again. The Hopi describe this not as a metaphor for human weakness in the abstract, but as an actual historical event. The third world was a real place. Its destruction was a real event. The emergence was a real passage. And the evidence of that civilization, they have always maintained, is under the ground. In 1909, a man named G.E. Kincaid was exploring the area near the confluence of the Colorado River and a smaller tributary when he found something. The exact location, the exact nature of what he found, and what happened afterward have been subjects of intense debate ever since, because the primary source for the story is a newspaper article published in the Arizona Gazette on the 5th of April, 1909, and no independent verification of Kincaid's claims was ever produced in any official document. But the story itself is extraordinary enough that it has never quite gone away, and in recent decades, certain elements of it have started to look less like sensationalism and more like something that might have had a real basis. According to the article, Kincaid, who was described as an explorer working for the Smithsonian Institution, discovered a series of caves in the Grand Canyon that contained evidence of an ancient civilization of considerable sophistication. The caves were described as extensive, carved into the canyon walls at a height above the Colorado River that would have required significant effort to reach. Inside, Kincaid reported finding a long main corridor with side passages branching off at regular intervals, like the rooms of a large and organized settlement. He described artifacts including weapons, pottery, copper tools, and what appeared to be hieroglyph-like inscriptions on the walls. He described a large room that appeared to serve a ceremonial function, and at the center of that room he described a statue. The Smithsonian has denied any record of Kincaid or of the expedition he described. The National Park Service has maintained that there are no caves in the Grand Canyon matching what Kincaid described. The canyon area where the story places the discovery has been off limits to the general public for decades, officially because of safety and conservation concerns. And the 1909 newspaper article itself, which generated a brief flurry of attention when it was published, and then was largely forgotten for most of the 20th century, resurfaced in the 1990s when researchers began digitizing historical newspaper archives, and suddenly this old story was readable again by anyone with an internet connection and a willingness to sit with something that did not fit any existing framework. The questions that surround the Kincaid story are not simple. Is it a hoax? Possibly. The Arizona Gazette was not above sensationalism, and the period in which the article was published was one of considerable public appetite for stories about lost civilizations. Is it a distorted account of something real? Also, possibly, explorers and prospectors were ranging through the canyon country regularly in that era and finding things that did not always make it into official records. Is it a suppressed discovery, evidence of something that was found and then deliberately buried by institutions that did not want to deal with the implications. This is the version that circulates most widely online, and while the institutional suppression theory is harder to verify than the others, it is not as implausible as it might initially seem, because there is a documented pattern of archaeological and anthropological discoveries in the American Southwest being controlled, reclassified, or simply not published, not necessarily out of malice, but out of the bureaucratic tendency of large institutions to protect established narratives. The Smithsonian Institution, which is the largest museum and research complex in the world, and which has been a primary repository for North American archaeological material since the 19th century, has a complicated relationship with the archaeology of the American Southwest. This is not conspiracy territory. This is documented history. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the systematic collection of artifacts from indigenous sites was conducted on a scale that is now understood as deeply problematic. Objects of immense cultural and spiritual significance were removed from their contexts and taken to Washington, where they were catalogued, stored, and studied by people who had no relationship to the communities from which the objects came. The knowledge that went with those objects, the understanding of what they meant and why they mattered, was not collected. It was not considered necessary. The objects were the data. The people who made them and used them and gave them meaning were secondary. The result of this approach is that the Smithsonian's vast collection of Southwestern material includes objects whose full significance has never been understood, because the understanding required to comprehend them was left behind in the communities from which the objects were taken. And in some cases, the objects themselves, combined with what those communities have maintained about their own history, suggest connections and continuities that the conventional archaeological narrative has not incorporated. One of those connections is to the idea of pre-surface habitation, of life lived underground, or partially underground, as a chosen and organized way of existence, rather than as a survival necessity or a ritual convenience. The pit house, which is one of the earliest architectural forms found in southwestern prehistory, is exactly what it sounds like. A house that is partially or fully dug into the ground. The floor is below the surface. The walls may be partially earthen. The roof, which may be made of wood and mud, is at or near ground level. From the outside, a pit house settlement might look like nothing at all, just a series of low humps in the landscape. From the inside, it is a home, warm in winter because the earth retains heat, cool in summer because the earth absorbs it, stable, quiet, separated from the chaos of the surface world by a layer of ground that acts as insulation against both temperature and sound. The pit house was the dominant architectural form in the Southwest for centuries before the ancestral Puebloans began building the above-ground structures we are more familiar with. And the transition from underground to above-ground architecture is usually presented as a straightforward evolution, a sign of increasing sophistication. But some researchers have started to ask a different question. What if the movement upward was not a sign of advancement, but of adaptation? What if the people who built the cliff dwellings and the above-ground pueblos were not becoming more sophisticated, but were responding to something, a change in conditions, a threat, a necessity that pushed them out of the underground environment they had preferred and onto the surface? This reframing does not require a dramatic backstory. There are mundane explanations for why a culture might shift from underground to above-ground habitation. Climate change, population growth, resource pressure, conflict with neighboring groups. All of these could have driven the shift. But the direction of the shift is interesting, because the Hopi story runs the other way. The ancestors came from below. They came from a world that was underground, and the pit house and the kiva are not primitive stages before the development of real architecture. They are memory. They are maintained connection to the world below, kept alive in stone and mud and ceremony for as long as the people have been on the surface. Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico is a place that makes archaeologists nervous. Not because it is dangerous, though parts of it are fragile and remote. It makes them nervous because it does not quite fit. The great houses of Chaco, the massive multi-story stone structures built by the ancestral Puebloans between approximately 850 and 1,150 of the Common Era, are impressive by any measure. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the Chaco great houses, contained somewhere between 600 and 800 rooms, and may have stood 5 stories high in places. It was the largest building in North America until the 1900s, when steel and concrete made larger structures possible. And it was built by a people who had no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals, and no writing system. They were working with stone, wood, and an understanding of engineering that they carried entirely in their hands and their minds. The alignments at Chaco are the part that makes archaeologists most nervous. The buildings are not oriented randomly. They are oriented with a precision that implies detailed astronomical knowledge. The great kiva called Casa Rinconada, which is the largest freestanding kiva at Chaco and one of the largest ever found, is aligned almost precisely on a north-south axis. The alignment is accurate to within less than half a degree. Certain windows and doorways in the great houses are oriented to catch the light of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, or the moonrise at the 18.5-year lunar standstill cycle, a cycle that requires sustained observation over decades or generations to even identify, let alone build a structure to mark. The conventional explanation is that Chaco was a ritual center, a place of ceremony and pilgrimage, and that the astronomical alignments served the purposes of a religious calendar. This is probably true, but it does not answer all the questions, because the road system that connects Chaco to the wider canyon country is also something that does not quite fit. The Chacoan roads are wide, sometimes 30 feet across, and they run in straight lines for miles, cutting through terrain that would make easier going available if you simply followed the contours of the land. You would build a road like that if you were interested in something other than the easiest path. You would build it that way if the straightness itself had meaning, if the direction mattered more than the efficiency. And some of those roads end at stairways carved into the cliff faces at the edge of the canyon. They end pointing down, into the canyon, into the earth. Where were they going? What were they connecting the surface to? The Hopi have a word, Patawakatsi, that is usually translated into English as water life or life defined by water, but the concept is broader and deeper than that translation suggests. It is a term that encompasses the relationship between the living world above and the sustaining forces below, the aquifer, the deep water, the source that lies under the desert and makes life on the surface possible. The desert southwest is one of the driest regions on the continent. The people who have lived there for thousands of years have survived not by pretending the desert is something other than what it is, but by understanding its hidden resources, the water that flows underground, the springs that emerge at the canyon walls where the rock layers create the right conditions, the seeps and teenagers that collect and hold rain. The underground is not empty in the desert. It is where life actually is. This is not metaphor. The aquifer system of the Colorado Plateau is vast, ancient, and in places under enormous pressure from above. Springs emerge at the canyon walls not because of recent rain, but because of water that has been filtering through rock for centuries, sometimes for much longer. The Hopi have known where those springs are, have known how to read the landscape to find them, for as long as they have been on the mesa tops. And the springs, in many cases, emerge from the same rock systems that contain the chambers and passages where the evidence of pre-surface habitation keeps appearing. There is a spring near the base of one of the Hopi mesas that is considered sacred, one of those places where the boundary between worlds is understood to be thin, where the sipapu, the point of emergence, is closer to the surface than usual. The ceremonies conducted at that spring are not about the water alone, though the water is part of it. They are about the connection, about the maintenance of a relationship between the people on the surface and something below, something that was there before the people were on the surface, something that may still be there. Let's talk about what the archaeology has actually found, because the story gets more specific and more verifiable when you move from the general landscape of tradition into the specific record of excavation and survey. Beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 90s and 2000s, a series of survey projects in the canyon country of the Four Corners region, the area where Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico meet, began to document the full scope of ancestral Puebloan habitation in ways that earlier surveys had not attempted. Earlier archaeology had focused on the spectacular sites, the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, the great houses at Chaco, the canyon settlements at Canyon de Chelly. These were the sites that attracted funding and academic attention, and they are remarkable enough that the attention was justified. But the earlier surveys missed something. They missed the density of occupation at the margins, the small sites, the single-room structures, the isolated storage features, the places where people had been not as an organized community but as individuals or small family groups, moving through the landscape and leaving only faint traces. When the newer surveys began to find these smaller sites and to date them, a picture emerged that was much older and much more continuous than the standard narrative had suggested. The canyon country had been occupied. consistently and continuously, for far longer than the peak periods of Chaco and Mesa Verde implied, and some of the oldest occupation was the most subterranean. The deeper into the earth the feature was, the older it tended to be. The movement from below to above was not a one-time architectural revolution, but a gradual process that had been happening over a very long period of time, pulling people upward from the underground spaces they had occupied first and longest toward the surface world that now seemed so obviously the natural place for human habitation. But why? Why had they been underground in the first place? One answer is practical, and it is the answer that most archaeologists reach for first. The underground is thermally stable. In a desert environment, where summer temperatures on the surface can exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit and winter nights can drop below freezing, a subterranean dwelling maintains a temperature that is much more survivable without requiring constant fuel for heating or cooling. The underground is also protected from wind, which in the canyon country can be brutal and relentless. It is also naturally defensible. An entrance that requires you to climb down into a space is much easier to control and protect than a doorway that opens at ground level onto a flat plain. If you know there are people out there who might want what you have, going underground is smart. But there are things about the underground chambers found in the southwest that exceed what you would expect from pure practical calculation. The care with which some of them are constructed, the specificity of their orientation, the artifacts found within them that are not utility objects, but objects of apparent ceremony or identity, the art on the walls, the paintings and petroglyphs that appear in some of these underground spaces are not the art of people passing through. They are the art of people who considered this space meaningful, who felt it deserved decoration, who wanted to mark it with something permanent and expressive. The petroglyphs and pictographs of the American Southwest are one of the most extensive bodies of rock art in the world. They appear on canyon walls and on boulders in the desert, in dry washes and on mesa edges, inside shallow caves and on cliff faces that are barely accessible. There are hundreds of thousands of them, possibly millions, when you count all the small and isolated images that have never been fully catalogued. They range from simple marks, a hand, a spiral, a series of dots, to complex scenes depicting figures in motion, animals, celestial events, and imagery that has no obvious real-world referent and may represent experiences or visions that belong to an altered state of consciousness or a worldview that does not map easily onto anything familiar. Some of the petroglyphs and pictographs found in the most remote canyon locations, the ones that require significant effort to reach, depict what appear to be underworld imagery, figures descending into the earth. Spirals that are used in Hopi cosmology as a representation of emergence, of the turning motion by which consciousness moves between worlds. Serpent imagery that in southwestern tradition is associated with the underground, with water, with the connecting pathways between this world and the one below. And in some locations, figures that look like they are coming up, rising, emerging. The Hopi look at that imagery and do not need an archaeologist to tell them what it means. They know what it means. They have always known. It is their story, painted on the rock by their ancestors, maintained in the living tradition of their ceremonies, and connecting them to a history that goes back further than the categories of Western archaeology are fully equipped to reach. One of the most interesting figures in the history of southwestern archaeology is a man named Richard Wetherill. Wetherill was a rancher in Colorado who, in 1888, stumbled onto the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde while searching for cattle and immediately recognized what he was looking at. He spent years exploring the canyon country, finding new sites, excavating them with methods that were crude by modern standards but were better than what most people were doing at the time, and developing a detailed knowledge of the ancestral Pueblo and world that exceeded that of most academics of his era. He found Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon. He spent years working there, excavating and cataloguing what he found. Wetherill had no formal archaeological training. He was a cowboy who became an explorer, who became something approaching an archaeologist, because the evidence he was finding demanded that level of attention. He listened to the Hopi and the other Pueblo peoples he encountered. He asked them about what he was finding, and he took their answers seriously. And what they told him about the chambers, about the underground spaces, about the kiva, and its relationship to the world below, aligned with what he was finding in the ground in ways that he found impossible to dismiss. The academic archaeological establishment of his era treated Wetherill with a mixture of respect for his discoveries and condescension toward his methods. After his death in 1910, his contribution to the field was minimized. in part because he was not a credentialed academic, and in part because some of what he reported, including conversations with indigenous informants about the meaning of what he was finding, did not fit the positivist methodological framework that the discipline was in the process of establishing as its standard. Indigenous knowledge was not data. It was background, color, context. The real work was in the ground. This methodological framework has caused problems ever since, because the indigenous knowledge, when you actually look at it carefully, keeps connecting to the evidence in the ground in ways that the framework insisted were impossible. The oral tradition keeps describing things that the excavation keeps finding. The story keeps matching the object. And you can only maintain the separation between them for so long before the intellectual honesty required by genuine scientific inquiry demands that you reckon with what the convergence means. The kiva itself is worth spending some time with because it is the architectural key to everything. Every Pueblo community has kivas. They are underground or semi-underground chambers, usually circular though sometimes rectangular, and they are used for ceremonial and social purposes. The entrance is through the roof, by ladder. Inside, there is typically a fire pit for warmth and for the smoke that rises through the entrance hole, a ventilation shaft that brings fresh air from outside to feed the fire, and the sipapu, the small hole in the floor that represents the opening from the world below. The design of the kiva has remained essentially consistent for over 1,000 years. The earliest kivas found in the southwest, dating to the period before 700 of the Common Era, look substantially like the kivas being built in Pueblo communities today. This kind of architectural conservatism is rare. Buildings change, styles change, technologies change. The fact that the kiva has remained so stable across so many centuries is a sign that it is not merely functional architecture, it is sacred architecture. It is maintained not because it is the most efficient design for an underground ceremonial chamber, but because changing it would change the meaning. And the meaning is not negotiable. The meaning is this: we came from below. We came up through an opening into this world. The kiva is that opening. When you descend into the kiva, you are going back toward where you came from. When you perform ceremony in the kiva, you are in relationship with the world below, with the ancestors who made the emergence, with the forces that sustain this world from underneath. The kiva is not a room. It is a cosmological statement built in stone and earth, maintained through ceremony, and kept in the center of every community that traces its history to the emergence. Now, here is what makes the emerging archaeological evidence so significant. Researchers studying the relationship between kiva architecture and the earlier pit house forms have found a continuity that pushes the kiva's origin back further than previously recognized. The earliest kiva-like structures, chambers with a characteristic combination of ventilation shaft, central hearth, and floor pit, appear in the archaeological record in contexts that predate the ancestral Pueblo and cultural period that is usually associated with kiva use. They appear in contexts that are much older. In some cases, much older than can be easily explained by the conventional developmental narrative. This means the tradition of building underground ceremonial chambers with those specific features is older than we thought. How much older is still being worked out, but the direction of the evidence is consistent. When you push back against the accepted chronology, when you look at the oldest layers, the tradition was already there. It was not developing. It was already formed, already coherent, already meaningful in the specific way that it has remained meaningful ever since. In 1971, a Hopi elder named Dan Kachongva published a document that has circulated in various forms ever since, a written version of the Hopi traditional history and prophecy that he had committed to paper in an effort to ensure that the record was preserved. In that document, Kachongva describes the previous worlds in terms that are worth reading carefully. The first world, he explains, was a world of pure creation. The beings in it were pure and connected to the Creator. But over time they began to lose that connection and the world was destroyed. The second world brought those who survived into a new existence, but the same pattern repeated. A period of right living followed by a gradual corruption followed by destruction. The third world was the world of the most advanced civilization, a civilization that, in Kachongva's account, developed powers and technologies that enabled its people to do remarkable things but that were ultimately turned toward domination and conflict. And the third world was destroyed by water, by a great flood that ended the civilization and sent those who had remained faithful into the underground passages that eventually led them up into this world. The detail about technology in the Third World is one that most people who engage with Hopi tradition in a serious way note and then set aside, because the implications are uncomfortable. If the Third World was technologically advanced, if it had developed something beyond simple stone tools and oral knowledge, then what happened to that technology? Where did it go? The answer Kachongva gives is the same answer that the destruction narrative implies. It was destroyed along with the civilization that created it. The waters took it. What survived the emergence was not the technology. What survived was the people and the knowledge they carried in their minds and their traditions. But the physical record of the Third World, the ruins, the structures, the buried evidence of an existence below the surface might still be there, underground, in the deep places, in the chambers that have not yet been found or have been found and not yet fully understood. The Four Corners region of the American Southwest contains more archaeological sites per square mile than almost any other comparable area in the world. The estimate most often cited by survey archaeologists is that a significant percentage of all ancestral Puebloan sites remain undocumented. The surveys have been underway for over a century, and the number of known sites continues to grow with every new season of fieldwork, every new aerial survey, every application of remote sensing technology that can see through the soil to the buried features below. LiDAR technology, which uses laser pulses to create detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain, has been transformative in this context. In other parts of the world, LiDAR surveys of jungle-covered archaeological sites have revealed the outlines of cities and road systems invisible to ground-level observation. In the canyon country of the Southwest, where the terrain is not hidden under vegetation but is instead exposed in the full clarity of high desert light, LiDAR is revealing something different. It is showing the depth. It is showing what is below the surface. And what it is showing does not match what the conventional narrative said should be there. The underground features revealed by LiDAR and by ground-penetrating radar surveys, which are the other major remote sensing technology being applied to southwestern sites, include chambers and passages at depths, and in configurations that were not predicted by the existing models of how and where the ancestral Puebloans built. Some of these features are in locations that were not previously considered significant archaeological sites. They are under open desert, under the canyon floor, in places that look empty from the surface and are anything but empty from below. The Navajo Nation has been particularly active in pushing for comprehensive LiDAR surveys of its territory, which includes a large portion of the Four Corners region. The results of those surveys, when published, have consistently shown a density and complexity of subsurface features that was not previously appreciated. The landscape is not a simple surface dotted with above-ground ruins. It is a layered system with evidence of human activity at multiple depths and across a time span that is considerably longer than the established narrative has allowed for. There is a particular canyon in Arizona, one that most tourists never see, that the Hopi consider one of the most sacred places on Earth. I will not name it specifically, partly because the Hopi ask that some of their sacred sites not be publicized, and partly because the name is less important than what happens at it. In this canyon, there are springs that have been used ceremonially by the Hopi for as long as their tradition reaches. The springs emerge at the base of a cliff face, flowing out of the rock at a point where two geological formations meet, where the water that has been moving through the porous upper layer finally reaches the impermeable lower layer and finds the only way it can go, which is out. At this spring, and in the cave system that the spring has carved out of the softer rock around it, there are features that the Hopi identify as among the most significant evidence of the emergence. There are paintings on the cave walls that depict the Sipapuni, the great Sipapu, the primal opening through which the people came up from the Third World. The paintings are old, not by the standards of European cave art, which reaches back 40,000 years, but old by the standards of documented southwestern art, old enough that the pigments used are no longer commonly available in the region, old enough that the style matches forms seen in other very early ancestral Puebloan contexts. Around the spring, in the cave, and in the surrounding canyon walls, there are also features that have not been formally published in any peer-reviewed archaeological journal, but have been documented by Hopi cultural preservationists and by a small number of researchers who have been permitted. Access. These features include chambers that appear to be carved rather than naturally formed, passages that connect chambers at different depths, and in some cases structural elements, deliberate modifications to the rock face that imply sustained habitation rather than occasional ceremonial use. The Hopi call this place one of the doorways. Not the only doorway, but one of several points where the separation between the fourth world and the third is thin, where, if you know what you are looking for, you can still see the evidence of what was there before. Let's pause here and consider what we are actually dealing with, because the narrative thread we have been following has several distinct strands, and it is worth pulling them apart to see what each one is actually claiming. The first strand is the Hopi oral tradition itself, which describes a civilization that existed before the current human world, that lived underground, or partially underground, that reached a level of complexity and achievement that can reasonably be called civilizational, and that was destroyed by a combination of moral failure and natural catastrophe. The survivors of that destruction came up into this world through an underground passage and became the ancestors of the Hopi and related peoples. This tradition has been maintained continuously for an unknown but very long period of time, and is embedded in the architecture, the ceremony, and the daily life of Hopi communities in ways that make it not merely a narrative but a living cosmology. The second strand is the archaeological record of the American Southwest, which documents a history of subterranean habitation that is older than the conventional narrative has fully reckoned with, that shows a remarkable architectural and conceptual continuity across centuries through the Kiva form, and that is continuously revealing new features and new sites that complicate the standard developmental story. The archaeology does not prove the Hopi tradition, but it does not contradict it either, and in several specific respects, it aligns with it in ways that would require considerable creative dismissal to explain as coincidence. The third strand is the history of how Southwestern archaeology has been conducted and how indigenous knowledge has been treated within that conduct. This strand complicates both of the other two. It means that the archaeological record is incomplete in ways we cannot fully quantify because the systematic removal of objects from their contexts and the systematic exclusion of indigenous knowledge from the interpretive framework has produced a picture that is missing pieces, some of which are still sitting in the drawers of institutional collections, and some of which exist only in the living memory of communities that have been asked to wait patiently while outside experts decide what their history means. When you put those three strands together and hold them up to the light, what you see is not a settled story. What you see is an open question. A genuinely open question, not of the kind that gestures vaguely toward mystery for entertainment purposes, but of the kind that the people who study this region most carefully are actually sitting with. The kind of question that keeps archaeologists going back to the canyon country season after season, not because they expect to find something that fits the existing framework, but because they keep finding things that do not, and they are honest enough to know that the things that do not fit are the most important things they are finding. There is a phenomenon in the canyon country of the American Southwest that has no satisfying conventional explanation. It is called cultural continuity across discontinuity. The way it works is this. The ancestral Puebloan culture shows signs, in multiple locations across the Four Corners region, of what archaeologists call abandonment events, periods in which a settlement or a region that was previously heavily occupied was suddenly vacated, with people leaving behind not just portable goods but sometimes structures, sometimes food stores, sometimes objects of apparent ritual significance that you would not expect people to leave behind under normal circumstances. And then, sometime later, the region shows evidence of reoccupation, but by a people whose material culture is subtly but distinctly different from the culture that preceded the abandonment. The standard interpretation of these abandonment events involves climate. The great droughts of the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era, which are well documented in the tree ring record, are usually invoked to explain why populations moved. When the rains failed, the crops failed, and the people had to go somewhere that had water. This is plausible and probably partially true. But the abandonment events are not all aligned with the known drought periods. Some happen at times when the climate record does not show any obvious stress, and the reoccupations sometimes show a population not with a different material culture, but with a different relationship to the underground spaces. A reoccupied site sometimes shows new kivas, new subterranean features, built on top of or alongside the older ones, as if the returning population was re-establishing a connection that had been interrupted. What were they connecting to? What was down there that required reconnection after an absence? The Hopi concept of the ancestor is not the same as the Western concept. In the Western tradition, ancestors are people who lived before us and who are gone. They exist in the past. They are remembered and perhaps honored, but they are not present. The Hopi understanding is different. The ancestors are not simply gone, They have transitioned. They have moved into a different state of being that is not entirely separate from this world. They continue to influence and interact with the living community. The ceremonies conducted in the kiva are not memorial events for people who are no longer here. They are communications. Active, real-time communications with beings who are understood to be present in the world below, in the underworld from which the people emerged and to which the deceased return. This is not a belief system that developed in a vacuum. It is a belief system that developed in relationship to specific places and specific experiences. The underground chambers where the ceremonies take place are not arbitrary locations. They are chosen because of what is understood to be present there. The belief and the place are inseparable. You cannot understand why the kiva is the kiva, why it looks the way it looks and functions the way it functions, without understanding the deep time context of the emergence and the ongoing relationship with the world below. And that world below, in the Hopi understanding, is not simply a metaphysical construct. It is understood to be physically real. There is an actual underground world. The people came out of it. The way out was through a physical opening in the physical earth. The Sipapuni, the great primal Sipapu, is said to be located near the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers, at a location that has been identified by the Hopi for as long as their oral tradition has preserved the account. It is a real place on a real map, a place where the geology creates conditions that look, to an observer who knows what they are looking at, like a point of emergence, a spring rising from below, mineral-rich water pushing up through limestone into a pool that has been sacred to the Hopi for as long as sacred has had meaning in this part of the world. In 2016, researchers working with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office conducted a survey of a portion of the traditional Hopi territory that had not been previously subjected to systematic archaeological survey. The area, a stretch of mesa country between two more thoroughly studied regions, was chosen partly for logistical reasons and partly because Hopi consultants had indicated that it was an area of significance that had not received adequate attention from outside researchers. What the survey found changed the understanding of how long the area had been continuously occupied. The survey identified over 300 sites that had not been previously documented. Of those, a significant percentage showed subsurface features, underground components that added architectural and temporal complexity beyond what was visible on the surface. And of those subsurface features, a portion were dated by associated artifacts and by optically stimulated luminescence dating of sediment to periods earlier than the sites had been assumed to represent. The dates, in several cases, pushed the occupation of the area back to timeframes that did not fit comfortably with the established narrative. The results were published in a regional archaeological journal and received limited attention outside the specialist community. The dates were reported but not sensationalized. The connection to Hopi oral tradition was noted but not emphasized. The implications for the conventional chronology of southwestern prehistory were acknowledged but framed carefully, as adding nuance rather than challenging the framework. This is how archaeology actually works, slowly, carefully, in the language of technical precision, with results that accumulate over years into shifts of understanding that only become apparent when you stand back far enough to see the whole pattern. The pattern is becoming clearer. The canyon country of the American Southwest has been occupied for longer than we thought. The occupation began underground, or heavily underground, and moved gradually toward the surface. The underground spaces were not simply practical adaptations to a desert environment. They carried meaning. They were in a relationship with a cosmology that understood the underground as the source, the origin, the world from which this world came, and the people who built those underground spaces, who carved those chambers and maintained those kivas across centuries and millennia, carried with them a tradition that described exactly that. Let us go deeper into the specific architectural evidence, because it is detailed enough to be worth examining carefully. The ancestral Puebloan pit house, the earliest form of substantial dwelling found in the Southwest, typically consists of a circular or oval floor plan excavated to a depth of between 1 and 4 feet below the surrounding ground surface, with walls of adobe or stone rising above the rim of the excavation to support a wooden roof that is at or slightly above ground level. The entrance is usually through the roof, though some pit houses have lateral entryways. The interior features a central fire pit, storage areas, and in some cases features that appear to serve social or ceremonial functions. The evolution from pit house to kiva was not simple or linear. In different parts of the Southwest, The transition happened at different times and in different ways. Some communities maintained pit house architecture, while their neighbors were building above-ground structures. Some communities had kivas that were functionally identical to the pit houses in their construction, but were differentiated by size and by the addition of specific features that marked them as ceremonial space. The sipapu, the small pit in the kiva floor, appears to have been added to the ceremonial chambers at a relatively early stage in the development of kiva architecture, and it never disappeared. From the earliest kivas to the most recent ones, the sipapu is there. The opening to the world below is there. Some of the most significant recent work in southwestern archaeology involves what is called Great Kiva studies. Great kivas are the large, formal, publicly oriented underground ceremonial chambers found at Chaco Canyon and at some of the more complex ancestral Puebloan sites. They are much larger than the community kivas, large enough to accommodate hundreds of people, and they are built with a precision and a complexity that exceeds the community kivas in almost every dimension. The Great Kiva at Chaco, called Casa Rinconada, has a floor area of over 5,000 square feet. It is roughly circular, with a diameter of over 60 feet. The walls are masonry of the highest quality found at Chaco, and the features within it, the 4 large post holes that supported the roof, the firebox, the subfloor vault that may have been used for percussion effects during ceremony, the antechambers, and the floor pits, are all arranged with a formal precision that implies a highly developed architectural tradition, not an experiment, but a fully mature form. The Great Kiva at Chaco is not the oldest Great Kiva in the southwest. There are Great Kivas that predate it by centuries, and the earliest ones are, in some ways, as formally developed as the later ones. The tradition was not invented at Chaco and exported to the surrounding region. It was inherited at Chaco from somewhere earlier, from something older, from a tradition of building underground ceremonial chambers that had been continuous for longer than the Chaco period alone can account for. There is a body of oral literature among the Hopi that deals specifically with the beings who inhabited the Third World. These beings are called different things in different contexts, but one category of beings that appears consistently in the accounts is the Patki, a word that is often translated as water clan people or house on the water people. The Patki are described as having lived in the Third World in great houses, in structures of considerable size and permanence, along bodies of water that were larger and more extensive than the water sources of the current world. Their world was wetter, more abundant, more capable of supporting complex and permanent settlement. The Patki are not described as gods or supernatural beings. They are described as people, human beings, or beings enough like human beings to be recognized as ancestors, who lived in the world before this one, and who carried certain kinds of knowledge and ability that they brought with them through the emergence. The knowledge they brought included agricultural knowledge, architectural knowledge, and knowledge of ceremony, specifically the ceremony that maintains the relationship between this world and the world below. What is interesting about this in the context of the emerging archaeological evidence is the description of the physical conditions of the Third World. The Third World had more water. It had larger bodies of water. The pre-emergence world was wetter than the post-emergence world. And here is where the geological record becomes relevant. Because the geological record of the Colorado Plateau in the deep past, the record written in the rocks, and the sediment and the lake bed deposits that fill some of the valley floors, tells a story of dramatically changing hydrological conditions over tens of thousands of years. During the last ice age, the Colorado Plateau was significantly wetter than it is today. Large lakes occupied basin floors that are now dry playas. Rivers that are now intermittent or dry ran year-round with considerable volume. The vegetation was different, the animal populations were different, and the conditions for human habitation were different in ways that would have supported a larger, more complex, more permanent civilization than the desert environment of the post-Ice Age Southwest could sustain. And when the Ice Age ended and the climate shifted toward the aridity we see today, that civilization, whatever it was, would have faced a choice. Adapt or perish. Move underground where the temperature and moisture conditions were more stable, or leave. The Hopi story says that what happened at the end of the Third World included water, an overwhelming of the land by water. But the geological record of the Colorado Plateau in the transition period at the end of the last ice age does not show a simple drying out. It shows dramatic fluctuation, periods of extreme wet, alternating with periods of extreme dry, the lake levels rising and falling, the rivers surging and retreating, the landscape itself being renegotiated between one climatic regime and another. In that context, the memory of a world overwhelmed by water is not necessarily a metaphor for any single catastrophic event. It may be a compression of a long period of climatic instability into a narrative that makes sense of the end of one way of living and the beginning of another. One of the more unusual aspects of the Hopi emergence story, and one that gets less attention than the broad cosmological framework, is the specificity of the beings who guided the people through the emergence. In many versions of the tradition, the guide is described as an entity associated with the underground, with the earth itself, with the forces that sustain life from below. This entity is sometimes identified with the spider grandmother, a figure who appears in various forms across many southwestern indigenous traditions, and who is understood to be connected to the creative intelligence of the earth, to the web of relationships that holds all living things in connection with each other, and with the sustaining source beneath. The spider grandmother is not a simple figure. She is ancient in the traditions that invoke her. She is depicted as wise and patient, and sometimes as stern, unwilling to help those who have not earned help, perfectly willing to let the unworthy fail. She knows the underground. She knows the passages. She knows where the openings are and how to navigate between worlds. And she guided the people through the emergence not because they were special in any simple sense, but because they had maintained the values that made them worth guiding. They had kept their connection to the sacred. They had not followed the third world into its corruption. This is the moral core of the emergence story. It is not an adventure story or a history in the narrow sense. It is a story about what matters, about what survives and what does not. The civilization of the third world did not survive because it lost what it needed to survive: the connection to the source, the relationship to the sustaining forces below. The people who emerged into the fourth world carried that connection with them, built it into the architecture of their communities, the design of their ceremonies, the shape of their understanding of who they are and where they come from. The underground is not just the past. In the Hopi understanding, it is the ground of the present. It is where the sustaining forces are. It is where the ancestors are. It is where the ceremonies reach. And the evidence of its earlier habitation, the chambers and passages and subterranean features that the archaeologists keep finding, are not just historical artifacts. They are points of contact, evidence that the connection was once more direct, more physical, more immediate than it is now, and possibly evidence that it can be maintained. If the people above remember what the people below knew, the Anasazi, or the ancestral Puebloans as they are now more correctly called, left the Four Corners region in a significant movement that appears in the archaeological record in the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era. This departure, which involved the abandonment of sites like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon and the movement of populations southward and eastward into what is now the Rio Grande Valley and other more water-secure locations, has been studied extensively. The consensus explanation involves the Great Drought of the late 13th century, a period of reduced rainfall that the tree ring record documents clearly, and that would have made agriculture in the northern Four Corners region very difficult. But there is something about the way the departure happened that continues to attract archaeological attention. At many sites, the departure appears to have been orderly. Things were left behind, not in the chaos of flight, but in the deliberate arrangement of people who planned to be gone for a while, or who left in a way that maintained the integrity of the places they were leaving. Ritual objects were placed in specific locations. Chambers were sealed. Kivas were closed in ways that suggest not abandonment, but completion, the ending of a period of use in a manner that preserved the possibility of future use. Some researchers have interpreted this as evidence that the departure was not random or panic-driven but planned, organized by leadership that knew the conditions were going to require a significant change and that prepared the community for it. Others have suggested that the closing of the kivas in particular reflects an understanding that the places being left were not simply being vacated, but were being placed in a kind of stasis, held in readiness, maintained in their integrity against a return that the community expected to make. The Hopi oral tradition speaks of the migration period, the time after the emergence and before the establishment of the current Hopi villages on the mesa tops, as a time of directed wandering. The people were not simply moving randomly in search of better conditions. They were moving in response to guidance, following instructions that told them where to go and for how long to stay before moving on. The migrations were purposeful. They were testing grounds. The people who eventually settled on the Hopi mesas did so not because they ran out of places to go, but because they had fulfilled the requirements of the migration, had traveled to the four corners of the world and made their marks, and had finally arrived at the center, the place where the Creator intended for them to be. The marks they made during the migration are the rock art that covers the canyon country of the Southwest, the thousands of petroglyphs and pictographs that chart the movement of the clans, the spiral that marks a migration route, the clan symbols that identify who was there and when, the images that connect places across hundreds of miles into a web of meaning that is the Hopi map of their own history, written on the rock face that is the most permanent writing surface available in a world without paper. Let us talk about water for a moment, because water is central to this story in ways that go beyond the hydrological explanation. The Colorado River system is one of the most complex river systems on the continent. It drains an area of over 200,000 square miles, drawing water from mountains as far north as Wyoming and delivering it to the Gulf of California and Mexico. Along the way, it has carved the deepest canyon on the continent, exposed rock that is 2 billion years old, and created the landscape that is now one of the most studied geological environments in the world. It has also been the source of water, of life, for the peoples who have lived along it and near it for as long as people have been in the Southwest. The Hopi relationship with water is not simply the relationship of a desert people to a scarce resource, though it is that. It is a spiritual relationship, a cosmological relationship, a relationship that understands water as the primary medium of connection between worlds. The rain that falls from the sky comes from the clouds that the Kachinas, the spirit beings of Hopi cosmology, bring from the direction of the sacred mountains. The water that flows from the springs comes from the underground, from the world below. And the water that moves through the Colorado River system, cutting the canyon deeper with every century, is understood as a living force, a carrier of meaning, a medium through which the underground and the surface are in constant communication. The spring that emerges at the Sipapuni, the great primal Sipapu near the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers, is mineral-rich. The water it brings up from below is not just water. It is information from the earth itself, mineral data, about the conditions in the geological formations through which it has moved. It tastes different from other water. It looks different. It is warm, even in winter, because it comes from deeper than the seasonal temperature fluctuations reach. It is a reminder that the underground is not just a location but an environment, one with its own conditions, its own resources, its own capacity to sustain life in ways that the surface cannot. And the Hopi have always understood this. The ceremonies that bring rain are not separate from the ceremonies that honor the emergence. They are the same ceremony, approached from different angles. You bring rain by maintaining your relationship with the sky. You maintain your relationship with the sky by maintaining your relationship with the ground. You maintain your relationship with the ground by maintaining your relationship with the world below. It is a single system, and the human being is in the middle of it, the link between above and below, the point at which sky and earth communicate through ceremony and right living. Let's return now to something concrete, to specific features in specific places that allow this story to be evaluated not just as tradition or as interpretation, but as something that can be examined. In the canyon country near the Four Corners, there is a category of archaeological feature that has received increasing attention in recent years, called hypogeal sites, from the Greek for under the earth. These are sites where the primary evidence of habitation is entirely underground, where there is nothing on the surface to indicate occupation, and where the only way to find the site is to know where to look or to use technology that can see through the ground. Hypogeal sites are not unique to the Southwest. They have been documented on multiple continents in multiple cultural contexts. But the ones being found in the canyon country are interesting because of their relationship to the surface sites that sit above them. In several documented cases, a surface site, an above-ground ruin, turns out to sit directly above a much older underground feature. The above-ground structure was built, the evidence suggests, not randomly, but in relationship to what was already below. The builders of the surface structure knew about the underground feature. They built above it intentionally, placing the surface structure in relationship to the subterranean one rather than simply finding the most convenient location for construction. The above-ground and the underground are in relationship. They are a system, not independent sites. This has significant implications. If the above-ground ruins of the ancestral Puebloans were built in deliberate relationship to underground features that were already old when the surface construction began, then the story of southwestern prehistory is not a story of gradual emergence from simple to complex. It is a story of continuous relationship to an underground environment that was already significant, already meaningful, already inhabited or ceremonially engaged before the above-ground construction that we can see most easily from the surface. The underground came first. The surface was built in relationship to it. And the tradition that explains the underground, the story of the emergence, the cosmology of the kiva and the sipapu, is not a later interpretation applied to pre-existing structures. It is the original understanding, the framework within which the entire built environment of the American Southwest was organized, from the first pit houses to the great houses of Chaco to the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde and beyond. One of the most contested aspects of all of this is the question of time depth. How far back does the tradition actually reach? How long ago did the emergence happen? When was the Third World at its height, and how long ago was it destroyed? The Hopi do not give calendar dates. The tradition does not operate within a calendar-based chronological framework. Events are described in relationship to each other, in the order of their occurrence, in the accumulation of their meaning, not in the numerical sequence that a Western chronology would impose. This makes it impossible to use the oral tradition directly to establish when the events it describes took place in absolute time. But there are indirect ways to approach the question. The geological record of the Colorado Plateau, combined with what the oral tradition describes about the conditions of the Third World, allows for some rough correlation. The Third World is described as wetter, with larger bodies of water, with conditions capable of supporting a more complex and permanent civilization than the post-emergent Southwest could sustain. The last period in which the Southwest met those conditions was the Pleistocene, the period ending roughly 12,000 years ago. When the great ice sheets of the last glacial maximum were retreating, meltwater was filling basins across the continent, and the climate was in a period of rapid and dramatic change. If the Third World corresponds to the late Pleistocene period, then the emergence, the transition from the world below to this one, happened somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago. This places it before the conventional archaeological record of southwestern occupation, which has typically been placed in the range of 12,000 years ago for the Paleo-Indian period, the period of the Clovis and related cultures that are usually described as the first inhabitants of the New World. But new evidence from sites like White Sands in New Mexico, where human footprints have been found in sediment dated to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, is pushing the date of human presence in the Americas back significantly. If people were in the Americas 20,000 years ago or more, which the footprint evidence strongly suggests, then the timeline for a Pleistocene civilization in the canyon country of the Southwest is not implausible. It does not require extraordinary assumptions. It requires only that we take seriously the possibility that human history in the Americas is older and more complex than the conventional model has allowed. The White Sands footprints are worth dwelling on, because they represent one of the clearest and most unambiguous challenges to the conventional story of human arrival in the Americas. In 2021, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Science, documenting human footprints found in the alkali flat area of White Sands National Park in New Mexico. The footprints were preserved in sediment, and the sediment was dated using seeds of aquatic plants found in the same layers as the footprints. The dates came back consistently in the range of 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, placing human presence in the American Southwest during the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, when conventional models had assumed that the ice sheets would have made the Americas inaccessible or at best very thinly inhabited. The footprints themselves are remarkable in their detail. They preserve the shape of the foot, the spacing of the toes, the pressure patterns that indicate weight distribution and direction of movement. They are not the footprints of people passing through quickly. There are sets of tracks that indicate people walking slowly, changing direction, stopping, interacting with each other. There are tracks that indicate children walking alongside adults. There are tracks of large animals, mammoths and ground sloths, overlapping with the human tracks in ways that suggest contemporaneity. The White Sands footprints do not directly address the question of underground civilizations or Hopi emergence traditions. They are not evidence of the Third World in any direct sense, but they are evidence that the canyon country of the American Southwest was home to people far earlier than the conventional timeline has allowed. And they raise the question that all such evidence raises: if people were here 20,000 years ago or more, what were they doing all that time? What did they build? How did they live? And where is the evidence of their presence in the period between the footprints and the first clearly documented ancestral Puebloan sites? The gap in the archaeological record between the period of the White Sands footprints and the period of the earliest well-documented southwestern cultures is not necessarily empty. It may simply be underexplored, or it may be underground, in the chambers and passages that the surveys are only now beginning to locate and date. The Sipapu, the small pit in the kiva floor, has been the subject of considerable archaeological interest for obvious reasons. It is a constant feature of ancestral Puebloan ceremonial architecture across a span of over 1,000 years. It is small enough to be missed if you are not looking for it, but significant enough that it is never absent from the formal kiva design, and its meaning, in the context of Hopi tradition, is precise. It is the opening, the place where the passage between worlds is remembered and ritually maintained, the point on the kiva floor that represents the Sipapuni, the great primal emergence point, and that keeps the community in symbolic contact with the world from which the people came. What is interesting about the Sipapu from a purely architectural standpoint is that it is not functionally necessary. The kiva works perfectly well without it. The ventilation, the fire, the roof entrance, the seating arrangements, none of these require a small pit in the floor. The Sipapu serves no mechanical purpose. It exists entirely to mark something, to hold a place, to keep alive the memory of an opening. Some researchers, working at the intersection of architecture and cognitive science, have suggested that features like the Sipapu are evidence of what is called deep time encoding in architectural form. The idea is that certain architectural features persist not because they are functionally useful in the immediate sense, but because they encode important information about the community's understanding of its own origin and identity, information that is too important to be held only in oral form, and that is therefore built into the most durable and widely reproduced artifact available, the building itself. The kiva, in this understanding, is a mnemonic device, a memory palace in the literal sense. You go inside it to remember, and the Sipapu is the most specific and non-negotiable of the things it makes you remember. You came from below. The opening is in the floor. The world before this one is down there, and the ceremony that you are about to perform is a way of maintaining the connection between where you are now and where you came from. There is a road in the Chaco Canyon road system that has attracted particular attention from researchers interested in the intersection of archaeology and Hopi tradition. It runs northward from Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the Chaco Great Houses, and it continues for many miles across the Mesa country, heading in a direction that would eventually, if you followed it long enough, bring you into the vicinity of the traditional Hopi homeland. The road is not unique. The Chacoan road system includes dozens of roads running in multiple directions, and the interpretation of the entire system has been one of the most debated topics in southwestern archaeology for decades. But this particular road, the North Road as archaeologists call it, has an interesting termination point. Or rather, it has interesting things at its far end, features that appear at the northern terminus of the road that are not simply road end markers, but are something more complex. There are shrines, there are features that look like observation points, and below the edge of the mesa at the road's end, there are chambers. The chambers at the northern terminus of the Chacoan North Road have been investigated and documented. They are not simple natural cave formations. They show evidence of modification, of human shaping, of features that put them in the same category as other deliberately built underground spaces in the canyon country. And they are positioned at the end of a road that runs from the center of the most complex ancestral Puebloan civilization ever identified, straight to the north, to the edge of the canyon country where the world drops away and the underground opens up. What were they connecting? The great house on the surface, with all its ceremony and its astronomical alignment and its hundreds of rooms, to the chamber below, the above and the below, the fourth world and the third. The road between them, straight as an intention, wide as a procession, running from the center of what the people had built on the surface to the edge of what they remembered from below. The question of what kind of knowledge the people of the Third World possessed is one that the Hopi tradition does not shy away from, even if it addresses it with the kind of careful indirection that characterizes the tradition's treatment of its most powerful content. There are accounts in the oral tradition, some of which were recorded by early anthropologists, and some of which are maintained in living ceremonial contexts, that describe the Third World people as having possessed abilities and knowledge that exceed what the post-emergence world has produced. This is not described in terms of technology as Westerners would understand it, not as machines or devices or material systems. It is described in terms of understanding. The people of the Third World understood things that the people of the Fourth World have not yet understood. They knew how the world worked in ways that gave them capabilities that look, from the outside, like what we might call power. They could influence weather, they could communicate across distances, they could do things with the natural world that required not machines but knowledge, intimate and comprehensive knowledge of how things actually worked at a level below the surface of appearances. This kind of knowledge is described in multiple indigenous traditions across the Americas and around the world. It is sometimes dismissed as magical thinking, as the attribution of supernatural powers to people who simply had a deeper, practical knowledge of the natural world than their observers could appreciate. But there is another way to read it. The people of the Third World, if they were a civilization that had developed over a very long period in the stable underground environment of the late Pleistocene Southwest, would have had a very different relationship to the natural world than any civilization that has developed on the surface in the post-glacial period. They would have developed their knowledge in an environment where the underground was normal, where the relationship to the earth itself was immediate and constant, where the forces that sustain life from below were not abstract concepts but daily reality. What you know when you live underground is different from what you know when you live on the surface. You know the rock, you know the water, you know the mineral content of the air and the temperature gradients and the sounds that travel through stone and the places where the rock is thin enough to hear what is happening on the other side. You know the underground in the way that living in a place makes you know it. And that knowledge, accumulated over generations in a civilization that had time to develop it, would be extraordinary by any standard. Let's talk about what the Hopi themselves say about all of this right now, in the present, because the tradition is not a historical artifact. It is alive. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, which works to protect both the physical sites and the living cultural knowledge of the Hopi people, has been increasingly involved in conversations with archaeologists and federal land managers about the management of sites that are significant in the Hopi tradition. These conversations are often difficult because they bring together two very different frameworks for understanding what a site is and why it matters. The archaeological framework asks what can be learned from this site about the past. The Hopi framework asks what is the ongoing relationship between this site and the living community, and how does that relationship need to be maintained? In these conversations, Hopi cultural leaders have consistently articulated the same core position. The sites that archaeologists call ancestral puebloan are not simply ruins. They are not simply evidence of a past that ended. They are living parts of a continuing relationship between the Hopi people and the land, the underground, the ancestors, and the creator. The emergence story is not a creation myth in the dismissive sense that word is sometimes used. It is an account of actual events that took place in actual places, and those places are still here, still significant, still requiring the maintenance of specific relationships and specific forms of care. The underground chambers, the kivas, the subterranean features are especially important in this regard. The Hopi position on these features is not that they are interesting archaeological data. It is that they are the physical evidence of the emergence itself, the architecture of the transition from one world to another, and that they deserve the same kind of care and protection as anything else that is sacred and irreplaceable. This position has practical implications for how the sites are managed, for who has access to them, for what kinds of research are permissible and under what conditions. And it has intellectual implications for how the evidence from those sites is interpreted, for what framework is brought to the understanding of what the chambers were for and who built them and what they mean. The Hopi framework and the archaeological framework are not simply different opinions about the same evidence. They are different ways of understanding what evidence is and what it is evidence of. The caves of the American Southwest have been occupied by human beings for a very long time. The dry desert air that makes them archaeologically valuable, that preserves organic materials that would decompose in wetter climates, also preserves evidence of habitation across time spans that are much longer than the evidence usually discussed in popular accounts of southwestern prehistory. Dry caves in Nevada have yielded artifacts that are 12,000 years old. Dry caves in Utah have produced evidence of human use extending back to similar time periods. And the canyon country of the Four Corners region, with its combination of dry climate and geological complexity, contains cave systems that have been used by human beings intermittently for a very long time. Some of these cave systems have been studied carefully, many have not. The sheer density of sites in the canyon country, combined with the difficulty of access and the limited resources available for systematic survey has meant that the known sites vastly underrepresent the actual number of sites. And the ones that are known are, in many cases, only partially understood because the resources required to fully excavate and analyze them are not available or are not committed to this region in proportion to the significance of what is being found. But the trend is clear. The older the evidence, the more it is subterranean. The most ancient human traces in the canyon country are underground. The trajectory of human habitation in this region moved from below to above over a very long period of time, in a direction that the Hopi tradition describes in reverse as the emergence. From the world below to the world above, from the underground civilization to the surface world, from the third world to the fourth. There is one more thing that needs to be said about the Kincaid story. The 1,909 newspaper account of caves in the Grand Canyon containing evidence of an ancient non-native civilization, which has circulated as a mixture of alternative history and institutional cover-up story ever since it resurfaced in the 1990s. The reason the story will not go away is not simply because people are credulous or because the internet enables the spread of misinformation, though both of those things are true. The reason the story persists is that the canyon country of the American Southwest does contain deep, extensive, and ancient evidence of a civilization that preceded anything in the conventional archaeological record, and that evidence has been managed, controlled, limited, and in some cases removed from public access in ways that create legitimate questions about what is known and not being shared. The Kincaid story is probably not a straightforwardly accurate account of what Kincaid found, if he found anything. The details are too convenient, too perfectly aligned with the sensational expectations of the era, and the complete absence of any corroborating evidence from any source other than that single newspaper article is a significant problem. But the Kincaid story points towards something real, not because Kincaid necessarily found exactly what he described, but because the canyon country is genuinely full of things that have not been fully documented, disclosed, or explained, and the institutions responsible for managing that information have a documented history of treating indigenous knowledge as secondary, and of managing the narrative of Southwestern prehistory in ways that protect established frameworks, rather than following the evidence wherever it leads. This is not a conspiracy. It is an institutional tendency. Large institutions with established frameworks tend to interpret new evidence in ways that fit those frameworks, to minimize or defer evidence that challenges them, and to manage the pace and the framing of revisions to the official story. This is how institutions work. It is not malicious, but it is real, and it produces exactly the kind of gap between what is being found and what is being publicly acknowledged that generates the kind of speculation the Kincaid story represents. The answer is not to accept the Kincaid story uncritically. The answer is to demand more rigorous, more open, more collaborative investigation of the canyon country, conducted with the full participation of the Hopi and other indigenous peoples whose tradition is the other half of the evidence, and with the intellectual honesty required to follow the evidence wherever it actually leads. In the late 1980s, an archaeologist named Stephen LeBlanc was working on sites in the Mimbres region of southwestern New Mexico when he found something that bothered him. Not a spectacular discovery, nothing dramatic enough to warrant a press release, just a pattern. The sites he was working on, Mimbres sites dating to the period between roughly 1000 and 1130 of the Common Era, showed evidence of a very specific behavior at the moment of their abandonment. The ceramics, the famous Mimbres black-on-white pottery that is among the most distinctive and celebrated of all southwestern ceramic traditions, had been deliberately killed before the sites were left. Killed is the archaeological term for the practice of punching a hole through the bottom of a pot before burying it or leaving it in a site. It is a practice found in multiple cultures across the world, and its meaning is contested, but one of the most common interpretations is that it frees the spirit of the object to accompany the dead into the afterlife, or to travel with the people to wherever they are going next. The Mimbres sites were killed wholesale, not individual objects in individual burials, but entire assemblages of ceramics, punched and buried, at the moment the site was left. LeBlanc interpreted this as evidence that the abandonment was not traumatic or emergency-driven. The people had time to conduct this ceremony. They were leaving deliberately, completing the process of ending their relationship with this place in a formal and thorough way. What bothered him was not the killing of the ceramics. It was where they went. The Mimbres people left their sites, and the subsequent occupants of the region, the people who came after them, had a different material culture. The Mimbres ceramic tradition, one of the most technically accomplished in southwestern prehistory, simply stopped. It did not evolve into a later form at the same locations. It ended, was carried away by the people who departed, and whatever became of it happened somewhere else. The Hopi, when asked about the Mimbres tradition, as various anthropologists have asked them over the years, give an answer that is consistent with their broader account of the migrations. The Mimbres people were one of the clans. They were part of the larger movement of peoples across the landscape during the migration period. They came from somewhere, stayed, moved on, and eventually joined or became part of the larger community that settled on the Hopi mesas. Their ceramic tradition was absorbed, transformed, and is still visible in traces in the contemporary Hopi ceramic tradition if you know what to look for. The Hopi are saying, in other words, that the archaeologically documented movement of ancestral Puebloan peoples across the landscape during the migration period is not a mystery. It is their own history. They know where those people went because those people are them. The apparent discontinuities in the archaeological record, the places where one cultural tradition ends and another begins, are not gaps in the story. They are chapters in a story that has a narrator. The narrator is still here. They are on the mesa tops. And they have been trying to tell the story for a very long time. The implications of what is emerging from the canyon country are not simply academic. They are not just a matter of refining our understanding of pre-Columbian history or acknowledging the sophistication of indigenous oral tradition. They are implications about the nature of human history itself, about how long people have been on this continent and in what forms of complexity they organize their lives, about the relationship between the surface world we inhabit and the underground world we are only beginning to systematically investigate. The story the Hopi tell is a story about a civilization that developed sophistication and then lost it, not because of some inevitable historical law, but because of specific choices, specific failures, specific moments when the people chose domination over relationship, power over connection, their own interests over the sacred principles that had sustained the civilization in its better days. The Third World was not destroyed by outside forces. It was destroyed from within. Its own corruption made it unsustainable. This is a story we know, not in the sense that we have archaeological evidence of the Third World's collapse, though the evidence is accumulating in ways that suggest something dramatic happened in the deep prehistory of the American Southwest. We know it in the sense that the pattern it describes is recognizable. A civilization develops complexity, accumulates knowledge and power, loses its connection to the values that made the development possible, turns the accumulated knowledge and power against itself and against the world that sustains it, and faces a reckoning. The Hopi do not tell this story as a warning about other civilizations. They tell it as a warning about this one. The Fourth World, they say, is facing the same test that the Third World faced and failed. The same corruption is available. The same choices are present, and the outcome is not predetermined. The emergence was not a one-time event. The possibility of it is always present. The question of whether we, the people of the Fourth World, will be among those who maintain their connection to the values that sustain life, or whether we will follow the Third World into its destruction, is the living question that the Hopi tradition poses to anyone who is paying attention. The underground is still down there. The chambers are still below the desert. The springs still bring water up from depths that the seasonal weather cannot reach. Water that has been moving through the rock for centuries, carrying the mineral memory of everything it has passed through. The Kachinas, the spirit beings of Hopi ceremony, are still understood to live in the mountains and in the underground spaces between ceremonies, returning to the villages during the ceremonial season to participate in the life of the community, and then retreating again when their time is done. The sipapu in every kiva floor still marks the opening, still holds the place, still connects this world to the one below. The archaeologists are still digging, still surveying, still finding things that do not fit the framework they started with. The LiDAR surveys are still mapping features below the desert floor that nobody expected to find. The dating programs are still producing results that push the timeline back further than the established narrative is comfortable with. And the Hopi are still there, on the mesa tops, maintaining the ceremonies, keeping alive the knowledge, waiting for the outside world to catch up to what they have always known. The convergence is happening slowly, the way archaeological understanding always changes, in increments, in the accumulation of evidence over seasons and decades, in the patient work of people who are willing to sit with what they find rather than forcing it into categories it does not fit. But the convergence is happening. The Hopi said there was a civilization beneath the desert before this one. They said it lived underground. They said it reached a level of complexity and knowledge that the post-emergence world has not matched. They said it was destroyed by the consequences of its own choices, and that the evidence of it is under the ground. And now the ground is giving up its evidence. One survey, one chamber, one unexplained date at a time. What is below the canyon country of the American Southwest is not yet fully known. The surveys are incomplete. The excavations have barely begun in many areas. The technology for seeing below the surface without digging is still developing and will reveal much more in the years ahead than it has revealed so far. And the Hopi tradition, which has been waiting for the outside world to have the tools and the humility to actually look, has not changed. It was specific before the archaeology confirmed it. It remains specific now. And the specificity, the level of architectural and geographical and cosmological detail in the tradition, is the thing that keeps it from being simply dismissed as myth. Myths are general. They describe the broad outlines of human experience, the hero's journey, the flood, the creation, the fall. The Hopi emergence story is not general. It is specific about places, about architecture, about the nature of the underground world, about the conditions that led to the destruction of the third world, about the manner of the passage through the earth, and the nature of the fourth world into which the people emerged. It is specific in ways that look, increasingly, like historical memory of events that happened in actual places at actual times. Memory that has been maintained with extraordinary care across a span of time that we do not yet know how to measure precisely, but that is clearly very long. The desert keeps its secrets patiently. The canyon walls have been standing for longer than any civilization has been asking questions about them. The underground is there. The evidence is accumulating. And the tradition that knew about it before the surveys began is still alive on the mesa tops, still being passed from one generation to the next, still specific, still waiting to be understood. What lives underground in the canyon country of the American Southwest is a question with multiple kinds of answers. There are the physical things, the chambers and passages and subterranean features that the surveys are finding. There are the biological things, the aquifer systems and the cave ecosystems and the geological processes that have been shaping the underground environment for millions of years. There is the memory, carried in the Hopi oral tradition and in the living ceremonies of the Pueblo peoples, of a world that existed below and of the people who lived in it. And there is the question itself, unanswered and in some ways unanswerable in its full depth, but pressing, pushing against the settled framework of what we think we know about the deep human past, asking us to look again, to look more carefully, to look below. The Hopi have a phrase that is used in contexts of ceremony and of serious conversation. It translates roughly as, hold the door open. It means, do not close off the possibility. Do not assume you have all the information. Do not let the convenience of an established framework prevent you from seeing what is actually in front of you, or below you, or coming through the door you would rather keep closed because it leads somewhere your existing map does not account for. Hold the door open. The evidence from the canyon country of the American Southwest is asking for that kind of attention. Not credulous attention that accepts every claim without scrutiny. Careful, rigorous, genuinely open attention. The kind that starts with what the tradition says, takes it seriously as a source of information about the past, and then goes to look at the ground to see whether the ground confirms it. The kind that is willing to be surprised. The kind that is willing to find out that the story is older than it thought, that the civilization is deeper than it thought, that the underground is not just a location but a history. The canyon country keeps giving, the surveys keep finding, the tradition keeps matching the evidence. And the question of what lived beneath the desert before us, before the fourth world, before the emergence, before the moment the people came up and looked at the sky and began the long journey toward where they are now, that question is not closed. It is open. It is very open. And the answer is coming up from below, the way it always has. The way the water comes up from the aquifer, mineral-rich, pressurized, carrying the memory of everything it has moved through. The way the ancestors come back in the ceremonies. The way the tradition returns, generation after generation, to the same places, the same chambers, the same opening in the floor of the kiva, saying what it has always said, in the precise and patient language of a people who have had time to learn how to say it. We came from below. Something was there before us, and the evidence of it is in the ground. If you know where to look, And now, increasingly, we do. The canyon country keeps its deepest secrets in the deepest places. The surveys are pointing down, the tradition has always pointed down, the sipapu in every kiva is pointing down, and the civilization that the Hopi say was there before, the one the ground is slowly confirming, is still pointing the same direction it always has, from below, toward the surface, into this world. Into the light of the fourth world, which is the world we are in now, the world that is possible because the people who came before found the door and had the courage and the guidance to walk through it. The door is still in the floor. The opening is still there. The world below is still below, and the story of what it was and what happened to it is the story the desert has been keeping since before there were words for desert, before there were maps for the canyon country, before there were names for any of it. A story written in rock and water and ceremony, and the specific, unignorable detail of a tradition that has never let go of what it knows. Hold the door open. The answer is coming. There is a geological formation in the canyon country of the American Southwest that most visitors walk past without realizing what they are looking at. It appears in hundreds of locations along the canyon walls, in the mesa cliffs, in the road cuts where highway construction has exposed cross-sections of the rock. It is a layer, sometimes only inches thick, sometimes several feet, of a distinctive dark material sandwiched between the lighter sedimentary strata. Geologists call it the Pleistocene Paleosol. It is the ancient ground surface, the horizon of the last ice age, the level at which the Earth's surface stood when the last glaciation was at its peak, and before the post-glacial processes of erosion and deposition began to rework the landscape into its current configuration. Below that layer, in the rock below the ancient ground surface, everything is from a different world, a world before the current one, before the current climate, the current hydrology, the current ecological communities, a world that the Hopi tradition calls the Third World, and the underground chambers that the surveys keep finding are distributed not randomly through the rock sequence, but in a way that is correlated with depth below that ancient surface layer. The oldest features, the ones that push the timeline back the furthest, are below the Pleistocene Paleosol. They are from before. This is not a definitive proof of anything. The correlation between the depth of features and the age of the associated sediment could have multiple explanations, but it is a pattern, and patterns in the geological record, when they align with specific predictions derived from a specific oral tradition, deserve more than casual dismissal. The prediction from the Hopi tradition is that the evidence of the civilization that preceded this one is underground, below the surface of this world, in the stratigraphy of a time before the current world was established. The geological record of the canyon country is showing features below the boundary layer that marks the transition from the Pleistocene world to the current one. The prediction and the pattern are aligned. That is either a remarkable coincidence, or it is the kind of convergence that demands serious attention. Let us spend some time with the specific nature of what the surveys and the excavations are finding in the underground spaces of the canyon country, because the details matter and they tend to get lost in the broader narrative about tradition versus archaeology. The features being found in the underground spaces of the canyon country can be grouped into several categories. First, there are the architectural features, the things that indicate deliberate construction or modification of the underground environment. These include chambers that are clearly shaped by human activity, where the natural rock formation has been modified to create a more regular and usable space. They include passages that connect chambers, some of which are clearly natural and some of which show signs of having been widened or straightened by human effort. They include floor surfaces that have been prepared, leveled, sometimes plastered with clay or adobe. They include wall surfaces that have been smoothed or decorated, and they include specific built features within chambers, fire pits, storage compartments, ventilation channels, and the sipapu-like pit features that appear with a regularity that cannot be accidental. Second, there are the artifact assemblages found within these spaces. These include ceramic fragments from multiple periods, stone tools ranging from very early forms to more recent ones, worked bone objects, plant material in various states of preservation, fiber and cordage fragments, evidence of worked hide, and in some cases objects of apparent ceremonial significance, including carved stone objects, bundles of materials wrapped in fiber, and pigment materials consistent with artistic or ritual use. The artifact assemblages in the oldest underground features are small and simple. The assemblages in features from more recent periods are more complex. But the oldest ones are there, establishing the earliest horizon of what was happening below the surface in this landscape. Third, There are the biological remains, the organic materials that the dry cave environment preserves, charred plant material that can be radiocarbon dated, bone fragments from the food animals used by the occupants, human remains in some cases, not in great numbers but in sufficient quantities to tell something about the physical characteristics of the people who use these spaces. The human remains from the oldest underground features in the canyon country are consistent with anatomically modern humans. They are not a different species. They are people. But they are people who were in these spaces at dates that the conventional timeline does not account for. The anthropological study of underground habitation as a cultural phenomenon, not just in the American Southwest but globally, reveals something interesting about the relationship between underground living and the development of certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of social organization. Cultures that live underground, or that have extensive underground components to their material culture, tend to develop specific characteristics that distinguish them from surface-dwelling cultures. Underground cultures tend to develop sophisticated knowledge of geology, of the mineral composition of the rock, of the hydrological systems that move water through the underground environment. They develop this knowledge because it is immediately relevant to survival. Knowing where the water is, knowing whether a particular rock formation is stable or prone to collapse, knowing how the underground temperature and humidity vary with season and with location, knowing which passages connect to other passages and which are dead ends, all of this is operational knowledge that an underground community accumulates through experience and transmits across generations as essential survival information. Underground cultures also tend to develop sophisticated acoustic knowledge. Sound moves through rock in ways that are quite different from the ways it moves through air, and the interior acoustics of cave and chamber systems can be remarkable. Some cave systems have locations where sound is concentrated, where a voice spoken in a normal tone at one point can be heard clearly at another point that is not directly adjacent. These acoustic properties are not random. They are features of the architecture of the underground space, shaped by the geometry of the chambers and passages. An underground culture would know those properties intimately, would use them, would possibly organize the ceremonial use of the space in ways that took advantage of the acoustic properties for effect. The underground chambers of the ancestral Puebloan tradition, including the Great Kivas, have been studied acoustically. The results are interesting. The acoustic properties of the kiva, the way the circular form and the specific dimensions of the space concentrate and reflect sound, are not accidental. They are features that make the space particularly effective for certain kinds of ceremony, particularly music and chanting, where the acoustic environment becomes part of the ceremonial experience, rather than simply a neutral backdrop. The kiva is an acoustic instrument as well as an architectural form, and this acoustic design was maintained across the entire span of kiva architecture, from the earliest examples to the most recent, because it was understood to matter. An underground culture that had spent generations learning the acoustic properties of the underground environment would have carried that knowledge into any architectural forms it produced, including the chambers it built on or near the surface. The continuity of the acoustic design in the kiva, across a span of 1,000 years of architectural development, is itself a kind of evidence. It is evidence that the knowledge encoded in the kiva design comes from a tradition of underground habitation that is very old. One of the most significant figures in the modern conversation about Hopi tradition and archaeological evidence is a man named Lee Kuanwisiuma, who served for many years as the director of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. Kuanwisiuma has been a persistent and eloquent voice for taking the Hopi oral tradition seriously as historical evidence, not as secondary information to be noted and then set aside, but as a primary source, as data that belongs in the same category as the physical evidence found in the ground. His argument, made repeatedly in conversations with archaeologists, federal land managers, and academic researchers, is not that the Hopi tradition should replace archaeology. It is that the two should be in genuine conversation with each other, that the tradition offers something the archaeology cannot provide on its own, namely the interpretive framework within which the evidence makes sense, the context that allows you to understand not just what something is, but what it means and why it was, where it was, and what relationship it had to the people who made it and used it. This argument has been gaining traction in the field of southwestern archaeology in ways that would have been difficult to predict even 20 years ago. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, which requires federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funding to return human remains and sacred objects to affiliated indigenous communities, created a formal legal framework for indigenous communities to have a voice in decisions about how their ancestral material is handled. But it also created a broader cultural shift in how the relationship between indigenous knowledge and archaeological practice is understood. The shift is not complete. There are still archaeologists who treat the oral tradition as context rather than data. There are still funding mechanisms that prioritize certain kinds of investigation over the kind of collaborative work that would fully integrate indigenous knowledge into the interpretive process. There are still bureaucratic barriers to the kind of site access that would allow the Hopi themselves to participate directly in the investigation of the sites they consider most significant. But the direction of the shift is toward greater integration, greater respect, greater recognition that the tradition is a source of information and not just a set of beliefs to be noted and acknowledged before getting on with the real work. And as that integration deepens, the convergences between what the tradition says and what the ground shows are becoming clearer and more specific. The tradition keeps being right in ways that the archaeological evidence is confirming. Not always, not in every detail, not in ways that resolve every question, but consistently enough that the pattern of convergence is itself significant. Consistently enough that the question is no longer whether the tradition is a reliable source of historical information, but rather how much historical information it preserves and how to read it accurately. The relationship between the Hopi and the land they inhabit is inseparable from the relationship between the Hopi and the underground. This is not a metaphysical claim. It is a geographical and historical fact. The Hopi mesas are located above an aquifer system of considerable extent and depth. The springs that have sustained Hopi communities for centuries emerge at the mesa bases, where the geology allows the underground water to reach the surface. The agricultural techniques that the Hopi developed to grow crops in an environment that receives less rainfall than almost any other agricultural region in the American Southwest are based on an intimate knowledge of how water moves through the land, both on the surface and below it. The Hopi dry farming techniques, which allow for the production of crops in conditions that would defeat most agricultural systems, are not simply clever adaptations to a difficult environment. They are the product of thousands of years of observation and experimentation with the specific hydrological conditions of the Colorado Plateau. They involve planting in locations where the soil moisture conditions are optimal even in dry years, based on knowledge of the underground hydrology. They involve the use of specific varieties of corn and other crops that have been selected over generations for their ability to find water at depth, to put down roots that go deeper than the surface conditions would suggest are necessary. And they involve a timing of agricultural activity that is synchronized with the ceremonial calendar, which is itself a record of the accumulated knowledge of how the environment works across all the timescales that matter. This is not agriculture as a set of techniques. It is agriculture as a relationship. A relationship with the land, with the water, with the underground forces that sustain life on the surface, maintained through ceremony and practice and the transmission of knowledge across generations. It is the continuation, in an adapted form, of the relationship with the underground that the emergent story describes as originating in the Third World. The people who came up from below did not leave their relationship with the below behind. They brought it with them and they have maintained it ever since. There is a body of research that emerged in the 1990s and has developed significantly since then that looks at the content of Hopi ceremonial practice from a cognitive science perspective, not to explain the ceremonies away as psychological mechanisms, which would miss the point entirely, but to understand what kinds of knowledge systems are embedded in the ceremonial practice, and what that knowledge tells us about the history of the people who developed it. This research has found that the Hopi ceremonial system encodes an extraordinary amount of environmental knowledge of the astronomical cycles that govern planting and harvest timing, knowledge of the weather patterns that predict drought and flood, knowledge of the ecological relationships between species that affect both agricultural and hunting success, knowledge of the mineral and hydrological resources of the landscape, encoded in the specific locations where certain ceremonies are performed, and in the materials that are required for those ceremonies. Knowledge of the social and psychological dynamics of a small community living in close proximity under conditions of periodic resource stress, encoded in the ceremonial structures that regulate behavior, manage conflict, and maintain the cooperative relationships on which survival depends. This knowledge was not developed all at once. It was accumulated over a very long time through the kinds of sustained observation and experimentation that only a community with genuine continuity of habitation can conduct. You cannot develop knowledge of 18.5-year lunar cycles without maintaining careful records across at least 2 full cycles. You cannot develop knowledge of long-term drought patterns without memory that extends across multiple drought periods. You cannot develop knowledge of the deep hydrological systems of the Colorado Plateau without generations of observation of the springs and the water sources and the relationships between surface conditions and underground behavior. The Hopi ceremonial system embeds all of this knowledge, and the time frame required for that accumulation is very long, longer than the conventional timeline of southwestern prehistory easily accommodates, which is itself a kind of evidence. The depth and specificity of the knowledge encoded in the ceremonial tradition implies a duration of continuous habitation and observation that pushes back beyond the established framework. Not dramatically, not to a point that requires exotic explanations, but back far enough that the conventional story needs to be expanded to accommodate it. The Grand Canyon itself, the greatest geological feature of the American Southwest, is both a physical reality and a cosmological one in the Hopi understanding. It is the place where the underground world is most directly visible, where the erosive power of the Colorado River has cut down through layer after layer of the Earth's history to expose a vertical cross-section of deep time that is unmatched anywhere on the planet. The canyon is a wound, in a sense, a place where the surface of the Earth has been cut open and the interior exposed. And for a people whose entire cosmological framework is organized around the relationship between the surface world and the underground world, the Grand Canyon is a place of extraordinary significance. The Hopi relationship with the Grand Canyon is ancient. The canyon's rim and its interior have been the sites of ceremony and pilgrimage for as long as the Hopi tradition reaches. The Sipapuni, the great primal Sipapu, the original emergence point, is located within the Grand Canyon system, at the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers, a location that is accessible only by foot or by river, and that is protected by both the Hopi and the federal land management agencies as a place of profound significance. The Hopi make periodic pilgrimages to the Sipapuni, descending into the canyon along routes that have been used for centuries, performing ceremonies at the spring that marks the emergence point, and returning to the mesa tops with water from the spring that is used in subsequent ceremonies. This is not tourism. It is maintenance. The pilgrimage is not an optional spiritual exercise. It is a necessary part of the ceremonial cycle, a direct physical engagement with the actual location where the cosmological story is grounded in the landscape. The people go to the place because the place matters, because something is there, because the relationship between the living community and the point of emergence must be maintained through actual presence and actual ceremony rather than through memory alone. The National Park Service, which manages the Grand Canyon as a national park, has a complicated relationship with the Hopi and with the other indigenous peoples who have traditional connections to the canyon. The park management framework is oriented toward preservation of the natural environment and toward the visitor experience, 2 priorities that can sit in tension with the traditional land use practices of indigenous communities. But over the past several decades, particularly since the passage of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978 and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, the management framework has evolved toward greater recognition of indigenous traditional use and toward protocols that allow traditional ceremonies to be conducted at culturally significant sites within the park. The result is that the Sipapuni, the great emergence point of the Hopi tradition, is now formally recognized as a traditional cultural property and is managed with protocols that reflect its significance to the Hopi people. This is a legal and administrative recognition of something the Hopi have always known. The place is real, the ceremony is real, the relationship between the living community and the landscape feature is real, and the story of the emergence that grounds all of it is not simply a myth. It is the account of an actual event at an actual place, maintained in living practice for a very long time. Let us turn now to the question of what the underground world of the Third World actually looked like in the Hopi account, because the tradition provides more detail about this than is usually discussed in either the archaeological literature or the popular accounts of Hopi cosmology. The Third World is described as an enclosed world, not dark, but lit by a light that is different from the light of the sun, a light that comes from the earth itself, from the luminous quality of the underground environment that the people of that world had learned to inhabit. This detail is interesting in the context of bioluminescent phenomena that occur in certain cave and underground environments, where the activity of specific microorganisms produces a faint but real light that can make the underground visible without any external light source. The people of the Third World did not live in darkness. They lived in a kind of light that was not sunlight. The Third World is also described as having climate, not the harsh variability of the surface world, but a more stable and predictable climate maintained by the enclosed nature of the underground environment and by the thermal mass of the rock surrounding it. This is consistent with what we know about the interior climate of large cave systems, which maintain a nearly constant temperature year-round regardless of what is happening on the surface. The underground is thermally stable in a way the surface is not. A civilization that had adapted to the underground would have experienced climate not as a constant source of stress and uncertainty, but as a stable background condition within which planning and agriculture and long-term development were possible in ways the surface climate did not allow. The Third World had water. This is consistent with the hydrological reality of the underground Southwest, which contains vast aquifer systems under the desert surface. An underground civilization with access to these aquifer systems would have had access to water that was independent of the rainfall variability that makes surface agriculture in the desert Southwest so precarious. They would not have been at the mercy of the drought cycles that repeatedly stressed surface-dwelling communities throughout the archaeological record. They would have had a stable and reliable water supply. And they would have developed the knowledge to manage and use that water supply effectively, knowledge that would have included detailed understanding of the underground hydrology that is only now being mapped by modern hydrogeological surveys. The concept of the Sipapu extends beyond the Kiva into the broader Hopi understanding of the landscape. The Sipapu is not only in the Kiva, it is in the earth. It is in the places where the underground world and the surface world are in close contact, where the boundary between them is thin, and where movement between them is, if not easy, at least possible. The springs are Sipapu places. The caves are Sipapu places. The canyons where the underground is exposed by erosion are Sipapu places. The places where unusual sounds emerge from the earth, where the rock vibrates with underground water or underground gas pressure, are Sipapu places. The Hopi ceremonial map of the landscape is, in part, a map of the Sipapu places, the points of contact between worlds. The pilgrimage routes that connect the Hopi mesas to the wider landscape follow paths that touch these contact points, that keep the community in relationship with a network of places where the below and the above are in conversation. The ceremonies conducted at these places are not simply ritual observances. They are maintenance. The relationship requires attention. The connection requires tending. If the ceremonies stop, the connection weakens. If the connection weakens, the sustaining forces from below become less accessible. And the fourth world, without access to the sustaining forces below, is less capable of sustaining life on its surface. This is a cosmological claim, but it is also a practical one. The springs, after all, are real. The aquifer is real. The relationship between the underground hydrology and the surface life it supports is real. In a landscape where water is life, and where water comes primarily from below, maintaining the relationship with the underground is literally maintaining the conditions for survival. The ceremony and the ecology are not separate things. The ceremony is the form through which the ecological relationship is recognized and maintained. In 2019, a team of researchers from several institutions including the University of Arizona, the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, and the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office published a collaborative study that brought together dendrochronological data, stable isotope analysis, and Hopi oral historical accounts to examine the relationship between climate variability and ancestral Puebloan population movements during the period between roughly 800 and 1,300 of the Common Era. The study was notable for its explicit integration of indigenous knowledge alongside the scientific data, treating the oral accounts not as illustrative material, but as information that constrained and informed the interpretation of the physical evidence. The results were not dramatic in the way that a sensational discovery tends to be, but they were significant in showing that the Hopi oral accounts of the migration period corresponded in specific and verifiable ways to the patterns visible in the dendrochronological and isotopic record. The timing of population movements described in the Hopi accounts aligned with the climatically stressful periods documented in the tree ring record. The direction of movements described in the oral accounts aligned with the movement of people toward water sources that the isotopic evidence confirmed were being used during those periods, and the accounts of staying versus moving, of communities that persisted in specific locations despite climate stress versus communities that relocated aligned with the archaeological evidence of continuity and discontinuity at specific sites. The study demonstrated that the Hopi oral tradition preserves accurate historical information about events that took place over 1,000 years ago, information that is specific enough to be verified against independent physical evidence. If the tradition preserves accurate information about climate responses during the 12th and 13th centuries, there is no reason in principle why it should not preserve accurate information about events from earlier periods. The question is not whether the tradition is reliable. The study showed that it is. The question is how far back the reliable information extends. One of the features of the canyon country that has attracted increasing attention from researchers working on the question of underground habitation is the extent of the natural cave and passage systems that exist within the plateau. The Colorado Plateau is underlain by extensive karst formations, areas where the soluble limestone rock has been dissolved by water over geological time to create complex systems of caves, passages, and underground chambers. These karst systems are, in many parts of the plateau, largely unmapped. The surface expression of the karst, the sinkholes and disappearing streams and dry valley features that indicate underground drainage, has been documented in some areas, but the underground systems themselves are largely unknown in extent and character. What is known is that the karst systems of the Colorado Plateau are substantial. In some areas, the known caves extend for miles. In others, explorers entering through known entrances have found passages leading deeper into the rock that have not been followed to their termination. The system is not fully explored, and in the portions that have been explored, human traces have been found in locations and at depths that were not expected, based on the conventional understanding of where and how the ancestral Puebloans used the underground environment. The karst systems are not separate from the hydrological system that the Hopi understand as the life support system of the Fourth World. The karst formations are how the water moves. The caves and passages of the karst are the pathways along which the aquifer water travels from the point where it enters the rock to the point where it emerges at the surface as springs. The underground environment of the canyon country is not a static, sealed system. It is a dynamic, flowing system in which water, air, and the organisms that live in both are in constant movement. A civilization that inhabited that system would not have been living in a static, enclosed box. It would have been living in a flowing, dynamic environment with its own ecology, its own seasonal patterns, its own opportunities and constraints. The mythology of the Hopi does not treat the beings who are in the underground world before the people as abstractions. They are specific beings with specific characteristics, specific roles, specific relationships to the people and to the forces that govern life in both the underground and the surface world. Among these beings, the most significant are the Kachinas. The Kachina tradition is complex and has been the subject of enormous amounts of scholarly attention over the past century, not always to the benefit of the Hopi, who have had to watch their most sacred knowledge be packaged and sold in various forms to an outside audience that was attracted to the imagery without understanding or respecting the substance. But stripped of the commercialization and the misrepresentation, the Kachina tradition contains information about the relationship between this world and the underground world that is consistent with everything else the emergent story tells. The Kachinas are beings associated with the underground and with the forces that sustain life from below. They are not gods in the monotheistic sense. They are beings of a different order than human beings, more powerful in specific domains, connected to forces that human beings cannot directly access, but in relationship with the Hopi community and willing to participate in the maintenance of the conditions for life in the Fourth World in exchange for correct relationship, which means ceremony, right living, and the maintenance of the values that the Third World lost. The Kachinas come to the Hopi villages during the ceremonial season. They come from the underground, from the San Francisco peaks, from the sacred mountains where they reside when they are not in the villages. They participate in the ceremonies that bring rain, that maintain the connection between the people and the sustaining forces of the earth. And then they return, going back to the underground, to the place below, where they continue their existence in a world that is parallel to this one but below it. This is not a simple before and after story where the underground is the past and the surface is the present. The underground is also the present. The Kachinas are there now. The ancestors are there now. The Third World is not simply gone. It is below in a relationship with this world, a relationship maintained through ceremony and through the physical features of the landscape that allow contact between worlds. The Sipapu is not a door to the past. It is a door to a present that is underground, The great flood traditions of the American Southwest are not limited to the Hopi. The Navajo have their own flood tradition, the Zuni have theirs. The Pueblo peoples along the Rio Grande have various forms of it, and while the specific details vary across traditions, certain core elements appear with remarkable consistency. Water comes from below. It rises. The land is overwhelmed. The people who have maintained right relationship are guided to safety. Those who have not are lost. The consistent presence of the flood from below, rather than from above, is notable. In many flood traditions around the world, the flood comes from rain, from the sky, from above. In the southwestern traditions, the water often comes from the underground, from the aquifer system overwhelming its usual constraints and bursting through to the surface. This is not an impossible geological event. In karst terrain, where water moves underground through cave and passage systems, a sudden increase in hydraulic pressure can cause what are called phreatic explosions, places where the underground water system breaches the surface with sudden force, creating springs and wetlands and even small lakes in locations that were previously dry. On a large scale, a major breach of the underground aquifer system into the surface landscape would look very much like a flood from below. If the Third World civilization was living underground, in the cave and passage systems of the karst formations of the Colorado Plateau, a major phreatic event would have been catastrophic. It would have flooded the underground living spaces with water rushing in from the aquifer under pressure. The people in those spaces would have had to get out, moving through the available passages toward the surface, toward the light, toward the world above. The emergence would not have been a leisurely migration upward in search of better conditions. It would have been an emergency evacuation, a movement toward the surface driven by the flooding of the underground world. This scenario fits the geological record. The end of the last ice age, the period roughly between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, was a time of extraordinary hydrological instability in the American West. The melting of the ice sheet sent enormous volumes of water into the river systems and into the groundwater systems. The aquifer systems of the Colorado Plateau, which had been stable during the glacial period, received sudden and enormous inputs of water from the melting ice and from the increased precipitation that accompanied the climate transition. Springs that had been modest became powerful. Water tables that had been stable began to rise. Karst systems that had been above the water table began to flood. A civilization living in those karst systems would have been forced out, upward, into the surface world. Into a world of sun and open sky and surface water rather than the enclosed, thermally stable, aquifer-supported world they had inhabited before. The emergence from below to above is not just a cosmological story, it may be the memory of an actual hydrological event, the flooding of the underground world by the waters that came with the end of the Ice Age, driving the people of the Third World up into the Fourth. The memory of the underground is encoded not just in ceremony and story, but in the built environment of every Hopi community. The kiva is the most obvious example, but it is not the only one. The design of the Pueblo house, with its thick adobe walls that moderate temperature and its roof access that echoes the kiva's roof entry, carries traces of the underground aesthetic. The organization of the community around central plazas that function as open-air ceremonial spaces connects to the kiva's function as an enclosed ceremonial space. The relationship between the open sky above and the underground below, mediated by the community gathered in the plaza or descended into the kiva, is a constant spatial theme in Hopi architecture. The orientation of the Pueblo buildings is not random. The buildings of the Hopi mesas are oriented in ways that relate to the astronomical cycles that govern the ceremonial calendar, ways that echo the astronomical alignments found at Chaco Canyon and other ancestral Puebloan sites. The same knowledge of celestial cycles that informed the design of the great houses of Chaco is embedded in the layout of the Hopi villages, transmitted across the centuries of separation between Chaco and the modern Hopi Mesa communities, not through a continuous building tradition, but through the ceremonies and the knowledge system that the architecture expresses. The Hopi have maintained the knowledge in a living form, and the physical form of the built environment is regenerated in each generation from that living knowledge, rather than simply copied from the previous generation's construction. The knowledge comes first. The building is its expression. And the knowledge is ultimately the knowledge of the emergence, the knowledge of where the people came from and what their relationship to the underground world entails. There is a site in the canyon country that is known to the Hopi but that has received only limited archaeological attention because of its location, which is both difficult to reach and within a stretch of land whose management status has been contested between federal agencies and the Hopi tribe for decades. The site is described by Hopi consultants, who have seen it as containing underground chambers of considerable age and extent, with architectural features that are significantly older than any of the well-documented ancestral Puebloan sites in the surrounding region. The Hopi consider this site to be one of the earliest physical expressions of the Fourth World civilization, a place where the people who emerged from the Third World first established themselves before the dispersal of the clans across the landscape that is the subject of the migration period accounts. The site has not been formally excavated. The surveys that have been conducted in the vicinity have produced dates that are consistent with early occupation, and ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in collaboration with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office have confirmed the presence of extensive subsurface features. But formal excavation, which would require both funding and the complex consent and consultation process that sites of Hopi cultural significance require, has not been initiated. This is not an unusual situation in the management of significant archaeological sites in the American Southwest. The gap between the identification of a significant site and the completion of a systematic investigation of it can be decades. The bureaucratic, funding, and consultation requirements that govern the investigation of culturally significant sites on federal land are extensive, and the resources available to meet them are limited. The result is that the sites most likely to change our understanding of southwestern prehistory, the oldest and deepest and most significant ones, are often the ones that remain least investigated. The Hopi are patient. They have been waiting for the outside world to catch up to what they know for a very long time. The site will eventually be investigated. The dates will eventually be determined. The features will eventually be documented and published. And when that happens, the conversation between the oral tradition and the archaeological record will become more specific, more direct, and more difficult to dismiss. The convergence is coming. It is a matter of when, not whether. One of the most significant shifts in how the archaeology of the American Southwest is being conducted is the growing use of what researchers call collaborative archaeology, a methodological approach that formally integrates indigenous community members into the research process, not as subjects or informants, but as co-investigators and co-interpreters. Collaborative archaeology does not simply acknowledge indigenous knowledge. It builds the research design around it, using the tradition as a framework that shapes the questions asked, the methods used, and the interpretation of the evidence found. The results of collaborative archaeology projects in the Southwest have been consistently more illuminating than the results of conventional projects conducted without indigenous participation. Not because the archaeology is more dramatic, but because the interpretation is more complete. When the Hopi consultants who are participating in a collaborative project look at an artifact or a feature and explain what they know about it, the explanation often opens dimensions of the evidence that the conventional framework does not provide. A stone tool that is just a stone tool in the conventional framework becomes a specific category of tool with a specific function in a specific context. When the Hopi explanation of what that category of tool was used for and why is brought to bear, the evidence becomes richer, more precise, more informative, and in the case of the underground features, the collaborative framework consistently produces interpretations that are more consistent with the architectural and artifactual evidence than the conventional framework produces on its own. The conventional framework looks at an underground chamber and sees a pit house or a proto-kiva, an early form of a later development. The Hopi framework looks at the same chamber and sees a specific kind of space with a specific relationship to the cosmological order, a space that is what it is because of what the people who built it knew and believed and remembered. The conventional framework describes the feature in terms of its sequence in a developmental history. The Hopi framework describes the feature in terms of its meaning in a cosmological history. Neither description alone is complete. Together, they begin to approach something that can actually account for all the evidence. The story of the American Southwest is not over. It is not a closed chapter of human history, available for study but essentially complete. It is a living story, being continued by the communities who have inhabited this landscape without interruption for a very long time, and being recovered by the researchers who are beginning to understand that the living communities and the buried evidence are not separate sources of information about different things, but are the same story told in different forms. The Hopi elders who conduct the ceremonies in the kivas of the mesa top villages are in the same tradition as the people who built the first underground chambers in the canyon country. The knowledge they carry is the knowledge that survived the emergence, the knowledge that was brought up from the Third World by the people who had maintained it through the corruption and the destruction that ended that world. It is old knowledge, very old knowledge, and it is still alive. The archaeologists who are working with ground-penetrating radar across the desert floor, who are finding chambers and passages at depths and in configurations that the conventional timeline does not account for, are finding the physical evidence of that same tradition. The underground world that the Hopi say existed before this one is showing itself in the surveys, not dramatically, not with the clarity of a sensational discovery, but steadily in the patient accumulation of evidence that is the way that archaeological understanding actually changes. The two lines of evidence, the living tradition and the buried record, are converging. The convergence is not complete. There are still many specific claims in the Hopi tradition that have not been verified by physical evidence, and there are many physical features in the archaeological record that the tradition has not yet fully illuminated. But the direction of the convergence is clear. The tradition knew about the underground. The archaeological record confirms the underground. The tradition describes an ancient civilization below the surface. The archaeological record is finding evidence of a civilization below the surface that is older than the conventional timeline allows for. The tradition describes the emergence as the transition from below to above. The archaeological record is showing a trajectory of habitation that moves from below to above over a very long period of time. Hold the door open. The answer is coming from below. It is coming from the direction the tradition has always pointed, from the world that existed before this one, from the chambers and passages under the canyon country desert, from the spring at the Sipapuni that has been flowing up from the underground since before there were people on the surface to notice it, carrying the memory of what is below in its mineral-rich water, patient and continuous and real. There is something that happens to a person who spends real time in the canyon country of the American Southwest, not in the national park with the paved paths and the interpretive signs, but in the remote stretches of the canyon system where you are hours from any other person, and the silence is the silence of geological time. The rock walls are there, the sky is there, and somewhere below, you know the underground is there, the aquifer, the cave systems, the ancient chambers that the surveys are finding, the springs that are pushing up from depths you cannot imagine through rock that is older than any life form you can name. In that silence, the Hopi story does not feel like mythology. It feels like an account of something that happened here, in this specific landscape, to actual people who left evidence in the ground, and in the living tradition, and in the architecture of a ceremonial practice that has been maintained without interruption for longer than any of the civilizations whose history we learned in school has existed. The desert holds its evidence patiently. The spring at the Sipapuni has been flowing for thousands of years, bringing up the memory of the underground in its mineral content, marking the point where the people came through from below to above. The kiva floor in every Hopi community has its sipapu, the small hole that marks the opening, that keeps alive the memory of where the people came from, and what they left behind, and what they carry with them still. Something was below the desert before us. The Hopi have always said so, and now the ground is confirming it. One survey, one chamber, one unexplained date at a time. The story is not finished. The door is not closed. The emergence is not a one-time event in the distant past. It is an ongoing relationship between the world above and the world below, maintained through ceremony and architecture and the patient accumulation of understanding that comes from taking seriously what the land and the tradition are both trying to say. We came from below. The evidence is in the ground, and the people who have kept the knowledge alive are still here, on the mesa tops, watching the surveys, watching the evidence accumulate, and waiting for the world above to understand what the world below has always known. The connection between the Hopi emergence story and the specific geological and hydrological realities of the Colorado Plateau is not coincidental, and it is not simply the case that a desert people would naturally develop a water-centered cosmology because water is scarce. The specificity of the connection goes deeper than that. The Hopi tradition describes specific geological conditions that are consistent with specific geological periods. It describes specific hydrological features that correspond to actual features in the landscape, and it describes specific transitions, the flooding of the underground world, the emergence to the surface, the establishment of communities in the new world above, in ways that correspond to specific events in the geological and environmental history of the plateau. The geological transition at the end of the Pleistocene period, roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, was one of the most dramatic environmental changes that the Colorado Plateau has experienced in the span of human existence. The melting of the glacial ice sheets changed the distribution of water across the continent in ways that had immediate and profound effects on the underground hydrology of the plateau. The aquifer systems that had been stable during the cold, dry conditions of the glacial maximum suddenly received enormous inputs of water from the melting ice and from the increased precipitation that accompanied the warming. Springs that had been modest became powerful, water tables rose, and in the karst terrain of the plateau, where the underground plumbing had been shaped over millions of years by water moving through soluble limestone, the sudden influx of water pushed through existing passages and created new ones, flooding underground spaces that had previously been above the water table and accessible to habitation. This is the geological story of the transition period, and the Hopi cosmological story of the transition, the end of the Third World and the emergence into the Fourth, describes the same event from the perspective of the people who experienced it. Not in geological language, but in the language of lived experience. The world was overwhelmed by water. The people who were faithful were guided to safety. They came up from below into a world that was new and strange, and required them to develop a new way of living on its surface. The convergence between the geological story and the cosmological story is not perfect. Cosmological memory is not a geological survey. It compresses, dramatizes, and reorganizes events in ways that serve the purposes of understanding and transmission rather than the purposes of chronological accuracy. But the core correspondence is there. The underground world was flooded. The people came up. What was below became inaccessible. And the relationship to the below, the sustaining forces of the underground, had to be maintained through different means, through ceremony and architecture, and the specific knowledge of where the contact points between worlds still existed, rather than through direct habitation. Let us spend some time with the sacred geography of the Hopi tradition, because it is both specific and comprehensive in ways that illuminate the underground story. The Hopi understand their world as organized around 4 directional forces, corresponding to the 4 cardinal directions and to a series of sacred mountains that define the boundary of the Hopi world. To the west, the San Francisco Peaks near Flagstaff, Arizona, which are understood as the home of the Kachinas during the portion of the year when they are not in the villages. To the north, a series of peaks and landforms in the direction of what is now Colorado and Utah. To the east, a sacred mountain in the direction of what is now New Mexico. And to the south, sacred peaks in the direction of what is now southern Arizona and Mexico. Within that defined world, the landscape is mapped in terms of its significance in the emergence and migration stories. Every significant landform, every significant water source, every major canyon and mesa and spring is understood in relationship to the larger story. The landscape is not just a physical environment, it is a text, a historical record, written in geography rather than in words, of everything that has happened to the people in this place and of their relationship to the forces that govern life here. The underground features of that landscape, the caves, the springs, the karst formations, the places where the underground world is closest to the surface, are among the most significant points in that text. They are where the story is most directly grounded in the physical world, and they are the places where the evidence being produced by the surveys and the excavations is most directly relevant to the tradition. When a survey team finds a chamber below the desert floor in a location that Hopi consultants have identified as significant in the emergent story, the convergence is not just interesting, it is potentially decisive. It is the kind of specific correspondence between a specific claim in a specific tradition and a specific piece of physical evidence in a specific location that moves the conversation from the general question of whether indigenous oral traditions preserve historical information to the specific question of what historical information this specific tradition preserves about this specific place. The answer, as the evidence accumulates, is that the information is accurate. The places identified as significant in the Hopi emergence and migration traditions are, when investigated, places of archaeological significance. The underground features described as significant are, when surveyed, places where evidence of ancient human activity is found. The tradition is a reliable guide to the landscape. It knows where to look, and the archaeology, when it looks where the tradition points, keeps finding what the tradition says is there. The relationship between the Hopi and the other Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest is complex and has a complex history. but it includes a shared tradition about the deep past that is important to understand in this context. The Pueblo peoples, the communities along the Rio Grande and the Zuni and the Acoma and others, are not simply separate groups with separate traditions. They are communities that share deep historical roots in the ancestral Puebloan world and that maintain variations on the same core cosmological framework that the Hopi express in the most developed form. The emergent stories of the various Pueblo peoples all describe movement from below to above. The specific details vary. The names of the worlds differ. The beings who guide the emergence are described differently in different traditions. But the core structure is the same. There was a world below. The people came up. They are now on the surface. And the relationship with the world below is maintained through specific ceremonies and specific architectural forms, the kiva being the most common and most widespread. This widespread sharing of the core emergence narrative across multiple distinct and independent cultural traditions is significant in exactly the way that the sharing of specific narrative elements across multiple traditions is always significant. When the same core story appears in multiple independent traditions, the most parsimonious explanation is that the story preserves memory of actual events that those traditions' ancestors shared. The emergence from underground to surface is not a myth that was invented separately and independently by multiple distinct peoples. It is the memory of an event that their shared ancestors experienced, preserved in the varying forms that different communities have developed over the centuries of their separate existence. If that is true, the emergence was a real event. It happened to real people who are the ancestors of the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest. It happened in a real place, specifically in the canyon country of the Four Corners region and the surrounding area. And the evidence of what was left behind when those people came up from below is in the underground, in the chambers and passages that the surveys are finding, waiting to be understood, waiting to confirm what the tradition has always said. The archaeological concept of cultural memory is relevant here. Cultural memory is the way that significant historical events are preserved in the cultural practices, artifacts, and narratives of a community, sometimes for very long periods after the events themselves have passed beyond living individual memory. Cultural memory is not just oral tradition, though oral tradition is one of its primary vehicles. It is also embedded in ceremony, in architecture, in the material objects that a community produces and uses, in the spatial organization of communities and landscapes, and in the patterns of behavior that communities maintain even when the original reasons for those patterns have become obscure. The kiva is cultural memory in architectural form. The sipapu is cultural memory encoded in a specific architectural feature. The pilgrimage to the sipapuni is cultural memory enacted through practice. The Hopi ceremonial calendar, with its specific sequence of ceremonies tied to specific points in the astronomical year, is cultural memory preserved in time, in the organization of the year itself as a record of what matters and when. All of this cultural memory points in the same direction, toward the underground, toward the world that was below this one, toward the civilization that existed there before the emergence. And the archaeological record, which is the physical form of the evidence that cultural memory preserves in behavioral and narrative form, is also pointing in the same direction. The oldest evidence is below. The underground was first, the surface came after. The emergence happened. The two sources of evidence are not contradicting each other. They are not even simply corroborating each other in a general way. They are, in the most specific and verifiable cases, pointing to the same places, the same dates, the same features. The convergence is specific enough to be meaningful, specific enough to demand that the conventional narrative be revised to accommodate it, specific enough to take seriously the full implications of what the Hopi tradition is actually saying. We have been moving through this story from its broad outlines toward its specific evidence and back again, and it is worth pausing to notice what we have actually established by this point in the narrative. We have established that the Hopi oral tradition describes, in specific and detailed terms, a civilization that existed underground in the canyon country of the American Southwest before the current human world was established. This tradition is not vague mythology. It is specific about architecture, about the nature of the underground environment, about the circumstances that led to the end of the Third World civilization, and about the manner of the emergence into the Fourth World. We have established that the archaeological record of the American Southwest documents a history of subterranean habitation that is older and more extensive than the conventional narrative has fully reckoned with. The underground chambers, the Kiva tradition, the subterranean features found in surveys across the canyon country all point to a civilization that spent significant time and invested significant resources in underground living and underground ceremony. We have established that the geological and hydrological record of the Colorado Plateau is consistent with the kind of event the Hopi tradition describes as ending the Third World. The flooding of underground karst systems by post-glacial meltwater and increased precipitation in the period roughly 12 to 15,000 years ago would have produced exactly the kind of catastrophic displacement from underground to surface that the emergent story describes. We have established that the Hopi oral tradition is a demonstrably reliable source of historical information, shown to be accurate about events from over 1,000 years ago when tested against independent physical evidence. There is no reason in principle why its reliability should not extend further back in time. And we have established that the two sources of evidence, the living tradition and the buried record, are in convergence. They are pointing to the same places, the same periods, the same events. The convergence is not complete, but its direction is clear. Something was underground in the canyon country of the American Southwest before the current human world. The evidence for it is growing, and the tradition that has always known it is still alive, still specific, still reliable. The canyon country of the American Southwest is a place that rewards patience. The rock does not give up its secrets quickly. The underground does not reveal itself readily. The tradition does not simplify itself to accommodate outsider expectations. But for those who are patient, who come with genuine respect for both the physical evidence and the living knowledge, the rewards are extraordinary. What is emerging from the canyon country, slowly and in the careful language of accumulating evidence, is not just a revision of Southwestern prehistory. It is a revision of the larger story we tell about human history in the Americas. A story that has been limited by the assumption that human presence here is relatively recent, that the complexity of human life here is relatively recent, that the sophisticated knowledge systems of the indigenous peoples of this continent are relatively recent developments in an otherwise simple story of gradual cultural evolution from primitive to complex. The evidence from the canyon country challenges all of those assumptions. It suggests that human presence here is older than we thought, that the sophistication of human knowledge here is older than we thought, that the relationship between the people of the canyon country and their underground environment, the relationship that produced the Kiva and the Sipapu and the emergent story, and the ceremonies that have been maintained for longer than any of the civilizations we study in school have existed, is older than we thought. And the Hopi tradition, which has always maintained that it was older than anyone outside the tradition was willing to credit, is being vindicated by the evidence from the ground. Not fully, not definitively, not in all its specific claims, but in its core assertion that the canyon country has been home to complex human civilization for very much longer than the conventional story allows, and that some of that civilization was underground. The implications of what is being found in the canyon country extend beyond the narrow boundaries of southwestern archaeology. They extend to the larger question of what we know and what we do not know about human history on this planet, and specifically about human history on this continent. The Americas were, for a very long time, treated by Western scholarship as a kind of second world, a place that received its humanity from outside, from Asia, across the Bering Strait, relatively late in the human story. The old model put people in the Americas no earlier than about 13,000 years ago. The newer evidence, from sites like White Sands and from the growing number of sites that are producing dates pushing back into the range of 20,000 years or more, is overturning that model. People were here earlier, much earlier, and what they were doing in those early millennia is only beginning to be understood. The Hopi tradition places the beginning of the human story in the Americas, not at the relatively recent moment of the Clovis culture, or even at the somewhat earlier moment suggested by the White Sands footprints. It places the beginning of the human story in a time so deep that the world was literally different, that the underground was habitable in a way it is not now, that the conditions for the civilization of the Third World existed and supported a level of complexity that has not been equaled since the emergence. The Third World was not a primitive beginning. It was, in the Hopi account, the most advanced moment in the human story on this continent. And what came after it, the emergence into the Fourth World and the long migration period, and the eventual establishment of the Hopi and other Pueblo communities in their current locations, was not a development toward greater complexity, but a rebuilding from simpler foundations after the destruction of something that was more complex. This is a deeply uncomfortable narrative for the standard story of human progress. The standard story says we are better than our ancestors, more sophisticated, more capable, more advanced. The Hopi story says we are less than our ancestors in some important ways, that the third world had things this world has not achieved, that the emergence was not a step forward, but a step sideways, a survival into a different kind of world, and that the work of the fourth world people is not to progress beyond their ancestors, but to remember what their ancestors knew and to live in a way that does not repeat the third world's mistakes. This is a challenging message. It challenges the teleological assumption that history moves in the direction of improvement. It challenges the technological optimism that assumes more capability is always better. And it challenges the separation between humanity and the natural world that has characterized so much of the civilization that developed after the emergence, the civilization that built its houses on the surface rather than maintaining its relationship with the world below. The kiva is still being built. In every Hopi community on the mesa tops, kivas are maintained and used. Young men are still initiated into the kiva tradition, still taught the ceremonies that connect the community to the underground, still given the knowledge that makes the kiva not just a room, but a cosmological statement. The women's societies that conduct their own ceremonies in related spaces are still active. The ceremonial calendar is still followed, the pilgrimages are still made, the tradition is not a museum piece. It is a living practice, maintained by living people who understand its significance and who have chosen to maintain it not because it is traditional, but because it is necessary. Because the relationship it maintains is not an optional extra in a world that no longer needs it. Because the forces it engages are not symbolic abstractions. Because the connection to the underground, to the world below, to the sustaining forces that the fourth world depends on as surely as the third world depended on them, is real and ongoing and requires maintenance. In a world where the relationship between surface civilization and the supporting systems below is under stress, where the aquifer systems that sustain agriculture across the American Southwest are being depleted faster than they are being replenished, where the climate is changing in ways that are reshaping the hydrological patterns that Hopi traditional knowledge was calibrated to, the tradition's insistence on maintaining relationship with the below is not a piece of cultural nostalgia. It is a prescription for survival, the same prescription the emergence story has always offered. The people who maintained right relationship with the underground, with the sustaining forces below, are the people who survived the third world's end. The people who did not are the people who did not survive. The Hopi are still here. They have been here for a very long time, maintaining the ceremonies, keeping the knowledge alive, watching the surveys and the excavations and the remote sensing projects as the outside world slowly finds what the tradition has always known was there. They are patient. They have been patient for a very long time, and the patience is not despair, it is confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing something that is true and knowing that eventually the evidence will confirm it and the outside world will have to reckon with what the tradition has always been saying. As this story comes toward its conclusion, it is worth returning to the beginning, to the desert and the red rock walls and the shadows falling in ways that make the canyon floor feel like the bottom of a different world. Because that feeling, the feeling of depth, of layering, of worlds within worlds is not a projection, it is a perception. Something is down there. The canyon country of the American Southwest contains within its geology and its underground systems the evidence of a human history that is much longer and much more complex than the conventional story acknowledges. The Hopi said a civilization lived beneath the desert before humans were on the surface. They have been saying it in the specific, detailed, maintained way that real historical memory is transmitted across generations, not as myth in the dismissive sense, but as account, as record, as the preserved experience of ancestors who lived through the transition from the world below to the world above and who understood the importance of keeping the memory alive. Now, the evidence is emerging, not in a single dramatic discovery that overturns everything at once. In the patient, incremental, season-by-season accumulation of evidence, that is how archaeological understanding actually changes. The chambers below the desert floor, the dates that push the timeline back further than the conventional framework allows, the specific correlations between what the tradition describes and what the surveys are finding, the alignment between the geological record of the transition period and the cosmological record of the emergence, the growing recognition within Southwestern archaeology that the Hopi tradition is not just context but data. The convergence is happening, The story the canyon country is telling, written in rock and water and ceremony, and the slow revelation of what is below the surface, is the same story the Hopi have always been telling. And the two tellings are coming together in a way that is changing what we know about the deep human past of the American Southwest and about the nature of human history on this continent. The underground is real. The civilization that was there is real, in the sense that its traces are in the ground and the memory of it is in the tradition, and the two sources of evidence are converging on the same conclusion. Something was there before this world, something complex, something that built and knew and lived in the underground, something whose end, whatever caused it, sent survivors up into the surface world with the knowledge and the memory and the cosmological framework that became the Hopi tradition and the Pueblo tradition, and the living ceremonial practice of communities that have maintained continuous presence in the canyon country from that time to this. And the question that the convergence leaves us with is not whether it happened. The convergence of evidence is sufficient to say that something happened. The question is what it means. What does it mean that there was a civilization below the desert? What does it mean that its memory has been maintained with extraordinary specificity and fidelity for the entire span of the Fourth World? What does it mean that the people who maintain that memory are still here, still practicing the ceremonies, still making the pilgrimages, still building the kivas with the sipapu in the floor? It means the story is not finished. It means the relationship between above and below, between this world and the one that was here before it, is not a historical relationship that ended with the emergence. It is an ongoing relationship, maintained through the ceremony and the knowledge of people who have never forgotten where they came from and what they left behind. The evidence from the ground is confirming the story. The story is illuminating the evidence. And the canyon country desert, patient and vast and full of things that have not yet been found, is waiting. Hold the door open. The answer is coming from below. There is a particular quality to the silence in the canyon country at night. After the sun goes down behind the canyon rim, and the last light fades from the red rock walls, the desert achieves a quality of quiet that is different from any other silence. It is not simply the absence of human noise. The canyon country has its own sounds. The wind in the juniper, the distant call of a nightbird, the sound of water somewhere below the surface, moving through the rock in the darkness. But underneath all of that, beneath the audible sounds of the natural world, there is a deeper silence that is the silence of deep time itself. The silence of 2 billion years of rock. The silence of a landscape that has been shaped by forces that predate any human presence, and that will continue shaping it long after any human presence is gone. In that silence, the question of what was underground before us does not feel abstract. It feels immediate, pressing, close. The answer is below your feet in that silence, below the surface of the desert that has been there for all of human time. And the tradition that has been maintained in that landscape, the Hopi tradition with its specific account of the civilization that was below and the emergence that brought the people to the surface, sounds in that silence. Not like mythology, but like memory, the kind of memory that is so old and so well maintained that it has become indistinguishable from the landscape itself. The question of suppression, of information about the underground civilization being deliberately kept from the public, is one that circulates widely in discussions of Southwestern archaeology and of indigenous knowledge more generally. It is a question worth engaging seriously rather than dismissing, because the history of how this information has been managed has elements that make the question legitimate, even if the most dramatic versions of the suppression narrative are overstated. The management of archaeological sites in the American Southwest by the federal government has historically been driven by priorities that were not always aligned with the priorities of either the indigenous communities whose ancestral history the sites represent or the broader public whose understanding of American history would be enriched by more complete information about what the sites contain and what they mean. The prioritization of certain sites over others, the speed and completeness of publication of archaeological results, the decisions about which evidence is considered significant enough to warrant further investigation and which is set aside, all of these have been influenced by bureaucratic, political, and academic factors that are not simply a neutral response to the evidence. This does not mean that there is a coordinated conspiracy to hide the truth about underground civilizations. What it means is that institutional decision-making is shaped by the frameworks and priorities of the institutions making those decisions, and those frameworks and priorities have not always been well suited to recognizing and communicating the full significance of the evidence from the canyon country. The conventional framework of southwestern archaeology, which was established in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was built around a specific set of assumptions about what was possible in pre-Columbian North America. Those assumptions excluded the possibility of the kind of long-duration, underground, complex civilization that the Hopi tradition describes. Evidence that challenged those assumptions was not, as a rule, suppressed in any dramatic way. It was more often simply set aside, noted, and not fully pursued, interpreted in ways that fit the existing framework, rather than ways that challenged it. The result of this over time is a body of published knowledge that is incomplete in ways that the published knowledge does not acknowledge, because the things that are missing not from the record, but from the interpretation of the record. The features are in the ground, the dates are in the sediment, the artifacts are in the collections, but the interpretation that would connect all of those things to the full story the Hopi tradition is telling has not been made in the official literature with the specificity and directness that the evidence warrants. That is beginning to change. The collaborative archaeology approach, the legal frameworks created by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and the National Historic Preservation Act, the increasing recognition within the field that indigenous oral traditions are legitimate sources of historical information, all of these are moving the interpretation of the southwestern archaeological record in a direction that is more consistent with what the evidence actually shows. Slowly, but visibly, and the direction is toward the underground, toward the longer timeline, toward the recognition that the Hopi story of where they came from is more accurate than the conventional framework has allowed. The concept of emergence is not unique to the Hopi tradition. Emergence is one of the most widespread narrative themes in human mythology and cosmology across the planet. Stories of people coming up from below, of civilizations transitioning from an underground world to a surface world, of the earth opening and releasing the ancestors into this world, appear in traditions from the Americas, from Africa, from Australia, from Eurasia. The Navajo emergence story is one of the most detailed and most studied examples in the Americas, but it is far from the only one. What is interesting about the widespread presence of emergence stories is not that it confirms the Hopi story as true, because the ubiquity of a story type does not by itself establish the historical accuracy of any specific instance of it. What is interesting is that the Hopi emergence story contains specific details that distinguish it from the general category of emergence myth and connect it to specific events in a specific landscape. The Sipapuni at the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado, the specific architectural features of the kiva that encode the memory of the underground world, the specific geological and hydrological conditions of the Colorado Plateau that correspond to the conditions described for the Third World. These specifics elevate the Hopi story from the category of a general emergence myth to the category of a specific historical account that happens to be told in the narrative and ceremonial language of a living oral tradition. The distinction matters because it changes how the story should be evaluated. General emergence myths are valuable as cultural expressions and as reflections of universal human experiences, with the relationship between this world and what lies beneath or beyond it. But they cannot be evaluated against physical evidence in any direct way, because they do not make specific claims about specific places and specific events. The Hopi emergence story makes those specific claims, and the physical evidence is confirming them, not in the general sense that underground spaces exist in the canyon country, which everyone has always known, but in the specific sense that underground spaces with specific characteristics corresponding to specific elements of the tradition exist in specific locations that the tradition identifies as significant. The Hopi prophecies, which are distinct from but connected to the origin and emergence stories, include descriptions of the signs that will mark the approach of the end of the Fourth World. The prophecies are, like all prophecy traditions, difficult to evaluate in the conventional historical sense because their significance depends on events that may or may not have occurred. But they are relevant to this discussion because of what they say about the relationship between the surface civilization and the underground sustaining forces. The Hopi prophecies consistently describe the end of the Fourth World as coming when the people of the surface world have lost their connection to the earth below. When the digging for resources becomes so extreme that the underground systems that sustain life are disrupted. When the water that comes from below is compromised by the contamination from above. When the ceremonies that maintain the relationship between surface and underground are no longer practiced in enough communities by enough people to sustain the connection. The Fourth World ends, in these accounts, the same way the Third World ended, by the loss of the relationship with the sustaining forces below, by the choice of power and exploitation over relationship and care. Whether one takes the prophecies as predictive in a literal sense or as diagnostic in a more general sense, the pattern they describe is recognizable. The aquifer systems of the American Southwest, including the aquifer that the Hopi Mesa springs draw from, are under significant stress from the demands of the surface civilization that has grown up around them. The Colorado River, which carries the water that the Hopi tradition understands as the expression of the sustaining forces of the underground, is overallocated, its flows managed and diverted to the point where it no longer reliably reaches the sea. The spring at the Sipapuni, the great primal emergence point, flows less abundantly than it did in previous generations, and the mineral-rich water it brings up from below is increasingly showing evidence of surface contamination. These are not mythological concerns. They are documented hydrological realities, and they are described in the Hopi prophecies as precisely the signs that the fourth world is approaching the same transition that ended the third world. Not as a supernatural punishment, but as the natural consequence of losing the relationship with the sustaining forces below. When you exploit the underground rather than caring for it, the underground cannot continue to sustain you. The logic is simple. The evidence for its operation is in the aquifer levels, and the spring flows, and the chemistry of the water that rises from below. One of the questions that this entire story raises, and that is worth addressing directly, is the question of what an underground civilization would actually have been like. What daily life in the third world would have looked like for the people who lived there. Because the Hopi tradition, while it describes the third world as complex and sophisticated, does not provide the kind of detailed material description that would allow for a concrete picture of what it looked like to live there. But the archaeological record of underground habitation in the Canyon Country, combined with what we know about the habitation of natural cave and passage systems in other parts of the world, allows for some informed speculation, not fictional elaboration, but the kind of reasoned inference that helps to make the concept concrete. An underground civilization in the karst systems of the Colorado Plateau would have had access to the aquifer. Water would not have been the scarce resource it is on the surface. Springs within the cave system, emerging from the limestone walls into naturally formed pools, would have provided reliable water year-round, regardless of surface rainfall. This changes everything about what kind of agriculture and food production would have been possible. With reliable water, agriculture in the cave systems would have been feasible, in the areas near the cave entrances where enough light penetrated to support growth, and in the more open sections of the system where natural skylights, places where the cave ceiling had collapsed or thinned, allowed light to reach the cave floor. The temperature in the cave system would have been stable, in the range of 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, which is cool enough to require warm clothing, but mild enough to be survivable and to support the storage of food without the extremes of freezing and thawing that complicate surface storage in the Canyon Country. The cave environment would have favored the accumulation of stores, the building of food reserves that could sustain the community through periods when the cave agriculture was producing less, or when the hunting in the areas around the cave entrances was poor. The social organization that such a civilization would have developed would be shaped by the specific constraints and affordances of the underground environment. The cave system is a network of connected spaces, and movement through it requires knowledge of the network. The people who knew the cave system best, who knew all the passages and all the chambers and all the water sources, and all the places where the ceiling was low enough to require crawling, and all the places where it opened up into large usable spaces, those people would have had a form of power and status that was based on knowledge rather than physical strength or accumulated wealth. The underground is a place where knowledge of place is power. The underground cartographer, the person who knew the map, would have been among the most important people in the community. The art in the underground would have been shaped by the underground environment. The surfaces available for artistic expression would have been the cave walls and ceilings, the same surfaces that show the extraordinary art of the European Paleolithic caves 40,000 years ago, and that show evidence of ancestral Puebloan engagement in the Canyon Country caves that have been documented. The art in the underground serves different purposes than art on the open-air surfaces of the canyon walls. In the underground, the art is always in a specific relationship with the space, with the acoustic properties of the chamber, with the way the light falls when a fire or a lamp is the only light source. Art made in that context is not decorative, it is participatory. The viewer is inside it, surrounded by it. The cave walls and the art on them and the people gathered around the fire in the center of the chamber are a single environment, a total experience, not a gallery visit. The question of what happened to the knowledge of the third world after the emergence is one that the Hopi tradition addresses indirectly. The tradition is clear that the people who came through the emergence brought with them certain kinds of knowledge. Agricultural knowledge, encoded in the seed varieties they carried. Architectural knowledge, encoded in the forms they built. Ceremonial knowledge, encoded in the practices they maintained. And cosmological knowledge, the understanding of where they came from and what their relationship to the below required of them. But there is also an acknowledgement in the tradition that some things were lost, that the crossing from one world to another required leaving some things behind, that the third world, for all its corruption and its ultimate failure, had aspects and capacities that the fourth world has not recovered. The tradition does not specify what these were in ways that translate easily into the categories of modern understanding, but the sense of loss is there, the acknowledgement that something of value was in the third world that is not fully available in the fourth. This is a common element in transition narratives across many traditions, the sense that the new world, whatever its advantages, does not have everything the old world had, that something was lost in the transition that was valuable, even precious, that the new beginning is also, in some ways, a diminishment. The Hopi hold this sense of loss within the larger understanding that the transition was necessary, and the fourth world is the appropriate world for the people now. But they also hold it as a motivation to maintain the knowledge that did survive, the ceremonial practices that preserve the relationship with the below, the architectural forms that encode the memory of the underground, the stories that keep alive the account of the third world in enough detail that the people of the fourth world can understand where they came from and what they lost and why they must not lose what they still have. The underground chambers of the canyon country are not all the same. The surveys that have been documenting them over the past several decades have found a remarkable variety in their size, their construction, their orientation, their associated features, and their age. Some are very old, some are more recent. Some show evidence of continuous use across very long time periods, with layers of occupation accumulating in the sediment on the chamber floor in a stratigraphic sequence that reads like a vertical history of the space. Some are single-period sites, used for a concentrated period and then sealed or abandoned. The oldest chambers, the ones with the deepest stratigraphic sequences and the earliest associated dates, tend to be the ones that are most difficult to access. They're in the deepest parts of the cave systems, in passages that require knowledge of the network to find and skill and physical flexibility to traverse. They are not places you stumble into. They are places you know about, places you have been led to, places that require a relationship with the people who know them in order to find them. This is consistent with the Hopi tradition's account of the knowledge of the underground as guarded knowledge, specialist knowledge, knowledge that was held by specific individuals and specific societies within the community, and transmitted through formal initiation rather than widely shared. The deepest chambers are not for everyone. They are for the people who have earned the right to know them through the process of initiation that the Kachina societies and other ceremonial societies conduct. You do not go into the deepest underground without being prepared, without being accompanied by those who know the way, without having been given the knowledge that makes the journey safe. This is both a spiritual claim and a practical one. In actual cave systems, the deep interior is dangerous without knowledge of the passages and without experience of the specific hazards of the specific system. Getting lost in an extensive cave system, even a well-lit cave system with modern equipment, is a real danger. In a cave system navigated by fire and torch in the deep past, without any mapped record of the passages, the knowledge of how to move through it safely was literally survival knowledge. The people who had that knowledge were the people on whom the community's relationship to the deepest underground depended. And the ceremonies that transmitted that knowledge and marked its transmission, the initiations and the preparation rituals, were not just symbolic. They were educational. They were the process by which the knowledge of the deep underground was transferred from one generation to the next. There is a phenomenon that occurs in certain cave systems, and that has been documented in the cave systems of the canyon country, called speleothem formation. Speleothems are the mineral deposits that form when water-carrying dissolved minerals moves through cave walls or drips from cave ceilings and deposits those minerals as the water evaporates or loses its dissolved carbon dioxide. The most familiar speleothems are stalactites, which hang from the ceiling, and stalagmites, which grow up from the floor. But there are many other forms, including the thin, delicate formations called cave curtains and the spectacular deposits called flowstone that can cover cave floors in translucent mineral sheets. The Hopi tradition includes accounts of the Third World underground environment that describe formations of this kind. The underground world is described as having surfaces that gleamed, that caught and reflected the light of the community's fire in ways that the dry, matte surfaces of the surface world do not. This description is consistent with the presence of speleothems, which in a firelit cave environment would create exactly the kind of gleaming, shifting, reflective quality that the tradition describes. The mineral formations in a well-developed cave system are among the most visually striking natural phenomena in any environment. They are the natural equivalent of architectural decoration, built by water and time rather than by human hands, but creating an interior environment of extraordinary visual complexity and beauty. A community that had lived in such an environment for generations would have incorporated its visual character into their understanding of beauty and of the sacred. The gleaming, translucent quality of flowstone, the delicate fragility of cave curtains, the slow, patient growth of stalactites in a darkness that saw no sunlight for millions of years, all of this would have been part of the aesthetic environment within which the Third World civilization developed its art and its ceremony, and its understanding of what was beautiful and what was sacred. The Hopi use of certain mineral materials in ceremony, including the turquoise that is central to many aspects of Hopi ceremonial practice and adornment, reflects an understanding of the aesthetic and spiritual quality of mineral matter that connects to the underground environment in ways that are more than coincidental. Turquoise is a mineral that forms in the zone where copper-bearing groundwater interacts with specific rock types. It is, in a very direct geological sense, a product of the underground. It is what happens when the forces below the surface create beauty from the interaction of water and rock over geological time. And the Hopi value for turquoise, their use of it in the most sacred contexts of their ceremonial life, is a continuation of a relationship with the underground that began in the Third World and has been maintained across the emergence and the migration and the entire span of the Fourth World's existence. As we move toward the end of this story, it is worth asking what the acknowledgement of the Third World civilization, if it is confirmed by the accumulating evidence, would mean for the larger project of understanding American history. The conventional history of the Americas begins, for practical purposes, with the period of European contact in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Everything before that is prehistory, a term that already suggests less importance, less complexity, less legibility than the period for which we have documentary records. The archaeological record is valued as evidence of what existed before the documentary record, but it is read through a framework that was established at a time when the scale and complexity of pre-Columbian American civilization were not appreciated. The evidence for complex, organized, large-scale civilization in the Americas before European contact has grown substantially over the past century of archaeological work. The cities of the Aztec and the Maya and the Inca have been studied in detail. The complexity of the Mississippian mound builders of the eastern North America has been documented. The sophistication of Chaco Canyon has been established. And the emerging picture of a continent that was home, at the time of European contact, to somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people living in societies of considerable organizational complexity is very different from the image of empty wilderness that the European colonial narrative required. But even this revised picture still begins relatively recently, in the period of the last few thousand years, and still treats the deep past of the continent as simple as a long, slow approach to the complexity that only developed close to the end of the pre-contact era. The evidence from the Canyon country, combined with the White Sands footprints and the growing body of evidence for very early human presence in the Americas, is challenging that picture. It is suggesting that the deep past of the Americas was not simple. That complex human organization, including underground habitation and the sophisticated knowledge systems that go with it, goes back much further than the conventional framework has allowed. If the Hopi tradition is accurate about the Third World, and the evidence is increasingly suggesting that it is in its broad outlines and in many of its specific claims, then the history of human civilization in the Americas needs to be rewritten. Not dramatically, not to claim things that the evidence does not support, but substantially enough that the pre-contact era is understood as containing within it a depth of human achievement and human history that has not been adequately recognized. This is not a small revision. It is a fundamental shift in how we understand the human story on this continent, and it requires, as a first step, taking seriously what the Hopi have always been saying about where they came from and what was here before. The canyon country of the American Southwest is one of the most remarkable places on Earth. Not because of its beauty, though its beauty is extraordinary. Not because of the spectacular geology that makes it unlike any other landscape, but because of what it holds. In its rock and its underground systems and its springs and its caves and its ancient chamber networks, it holds the evidence of a human history that is much longer and much deeper and much more complex than the conventional story is told. The Hopi have been the custodians of that history in the form of a living oral tradition that has maintained the account of the emergence and the migration and the establishment of the Fourth World with an extraordinary fidelity across a span of time that exceeds anything the Western historical tradition can match. They have maintained this not as an academic exercise but as a living practice, embedded in ceremony and architecture and agricultural knowledge and the daily disciplines of a community that understands itself as existing in ongoing relationship with the forces that sustain life from below. The archaeological evidence is catching up to the tradition. The surveys are finding what the tradition says is there. The dates are pushing back to periods the tradition claims. The features are corresponding to forms the tradition describes. The convergence is not complete, but its direction is clear and its pace is accelerating as the technology for seeing below the surface improves and as the collaborative approach to investigation becomes more widespread. What will the full picture look like when it is finally assembled? We do not know yet. The surveys are still underway. The evidence is still accumulating. The interpretation is still developing. But the direction is toward a deeper past, a more complex civilization, a longer and richer human story in the canyon country than the conventional framework has allowed for. The Hopi said a civilization lived beneath the desert before humans were on the surface. They have been saying it for as long as they have been on the surface, and now the ground is saying it too. The desert is patient, the underground is patient. The spring at the Sipapuni is patient, still flowing, still bringing up the memory of the world below in its mineral-rich water. The Kachinas are patient, still making their annual journey from the underground to the villages and back again. The Kiva Sipapu is patient, still marking the opening in every Kiva floor in every Hopi community. The answer has always been there, below the surface. Waiting for the question to be asked clearly enough and patiently enough and with enough genuine respect for what the tradition and the land are both trying to say. Now the question is being asked, and the answer is coming up. From below, there is a moment, if you have ever sat in a real kiva, not a reconstructed tourist kiva, but an actual living kiva, in a Hopi community on a night when ceremony is not being conducted, and the space is simply present and quiet, when you understand something that no academic explanation quite reaches. The kiva is not metaphor. It is not symbolic architecture in the abstract sense. It is a specific kind of space that does something specific to the person who is inside it. The walls are close. The light, when there is fire, moves. The opening above is sky. The Sipapu below is earth. And you in the middle are between, held between the above and the below in a way that the surface world, with its open horizons and its clear separation between sky and ground, does not offer. In that between space, the emergent story does not feel like history. It feels like present tense. The world below is below you. The world above is above. And you are at the connection point, in the architecture that was built to maintain that connection across the entire span of the Fourth World's existence. The people who built the first kiva and the people who build kivas now are all doing the same thing, holding the place, keeping the opening, maintaining the memory of where the people came from so that the Fourth World does not lose what the Third World lost, so that the connection to the below, to the sustaining forces, to the ancestors, to the world that was here before, is not broken by forgetting. The desert is large, the underground is deep, the past is long, and the Hopi are still here, in their specific place, in the specific landscape where the emergence happened and the migration ended, keeping the specific knowledge that allows the connection to be maintained. The civilization that was below the desert is real. The evidence is in the ground, and the people who have always known it was real are the ones who have been waiting, with the patience of deep time itself, for the rest of the world to find what they have always known was there. The spring flows. The Kachinas travel between the underground and the villages on their ancient seasonal paths. The Sipapu holds its place in the kiva floor, small and precise and patient. The surveys continue. The evidence accumulates. The convergence between the oldest living tradition in the American Southwest and the emerging archaeological record of what is below the canyon country desert is becoming. With each new season of fieldwork, each new application of technology, each new collaborative project between indigenous knowledge keepers and outside researchers, more specific and more undeniable, what was below the desert before humans were on the surface is coming into focus, not as myth, not as speculation, as the recoverable truth of a very long and very real human story that the canyon country has been keeping in its underground, patient as geology, waiting for the surface world to be ready to understand what the people below already knew.